She's here, it's fine. ask you to take a seat a few minutes behind where we'd like to be? The chat and conversation going to increase the temperature in the room. So morning, thank you very much for coming today. My name's Olivia Butterworth. I'm Head of Public Participation at NHS England. And it actually isn't about NHS England or what we've been doing. It's about the future and what other bits of the system, the health and care system, can do to improve services, supports and the experience of transgender and non-binary people. So I'm going to do some housekeeping really quickly. There's no fire alarm planned. If it goes off, it will be for real. The venue staff will see us out, and there's fire exits over there. And a button by the lifts, and the venue staff will come and help you get out of the building. And the muster point's around the corner, but you'll be escorted round there. Please don't run. Toilets are at the end of the corridor. They're at the same point on every floor. So if there is a queue, please go to a different floor. And Twitter and webcasting. We're webcasting today, so hello World Wide Web and people watching on the web. And we're doing that very deliberately in order that we can extend the conversation to all of those people we can't get into this room. So if you're watching on the webcast, you'll see there's not very many spare seats. So we can't bring more people into the room, but we can take this conversation out there. We can do that by webcasting, and Ruth, who's going to give us a little wave, who's busy tweeting, is going to be bringing the Twitter conversation. So the questions, the comments from people watching will get brought into the room via Ruth. If you tweet, if you can use the hashtag NHSGenderID, that helps to follow the conversation. If you don't tweet, but you've got something that you want to put out there, go and have a chat with Ruth and she'll tweet it for you. So I think that's kind of, the other bit about the webcasting is when we come to asking questions or making comments, if you don't have a microphone, you can't be heard. So we've got people with roving mics, and they will come and give you a microphone, but please wait until you've got the microphone. Time today is really tight. We've tried to cram a huge amount in. We've got some people who are going to tell us stories, and I've been quite brutal in saying to everybody, actually, you've got less than 10 minutes. So if I start to edge up for them to remove microphones from people's hands, it's me being quite assertive about time. And I think I'll finish by saying today is about honesty, today is about action. So people in the room, you're all from different organisations who have a role to play in taking action. And today we'd like to get to a place about so what next. So this isn't just another conversation that you had in an overly hot room on a very hot summer's day when you could have been watching Wimbledon. Today is about a conversation that leads somewhere to action. And on that note, I'm going to ask Barbara Haken, who's our National Director for Commissioning Operations, who's also been part of this conversation. That this conversation was hosted out back in September, and then we came back to it again in March. But I'm not going to say any more. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, and it's nice, I think, for everybody to be in a room that's not too hot. I don't know whether when the sun moves around it's going to get much worse, because it's certainly very, very hot outside, isn't it? So thank you to all of you for giving up your time to come to this event on such a lovely sunny day. I'm really delighted to be here, because I think that what today for me is about, it's about the journey. I think that NHS England has done its best after a somewhat shaky start. I think the NHS has had a somewhat shaky start in dealing with individuals with transgender or non-binary. And I think NHS England, after a shaky start, has tried really hard to engage and to listen and to try and do better than we have done thus far. And one of the things I want to do today is kind of give you all a personal commitment that we still really believe that, and that's absolutely what we're trying to do. But today is important because commissioners alone, there is a very limited, there are lots of things commissioners do, but it is limited, because in the final analysis, the interaction between individuals and the health service is with providers. So what really excites me today is that we've got lots of other representatives from other healthcare organisations here, where we can take that next step of the journey and say, what do we all need to do collectively? We've obviously got lots of representatives, lots of you who use the NHS and can help us with your experience and guide us to find a way of commissioning and providing the best services possible. But I think having a range of people from across lots of organisations will mean that we can kind of move faster, we can do more than we could ever possibly have done if it was just NHS England alone. That's really what a good commissioner does, in my opinion. A good commissioner of services actually brings together all those individuals who either use the services or deliver the services or can have an impact on the way those services are delivered. They bring them together in order to determine what the shape of those services should be and how they should be delivered. So for me, commissioning, it really is, it's quite difficult to give a simple definition of commissioning, but it is, for the most part, it's about planning, then agreeing, and then monitoring. And the most complex part of that is in the planning. And this is part of what we're here today and what we do. It is about planning, because planning is a breadth of things. Planning isn't just about sorting out numbers. Planning is about ensuring quality, making sure that patients get a great experience. So there are all sorts of things about the design of the service, and that's the whole of NHS services. That is the key part of what a commissioner does. So today, that's what we're here to do. And actually, what I also recognise is that we need to look at services across a broad range of angles. Because what I've heard when I've been talking to you, and we've had quite a number of occasions when I hope you felt that NHS England has been in listening mode and has tried to understand some of the issues you face when you use NHS services. But I've heard that there is a range of issues, and I've heard that one of the issues that you raise is about culture and attitude. And it is often when you perhaps are using NHS services for a broken arm or a cold or a cough, and that actually what you want and what everybody wants, absolutely everybody wants, is to be treated as an individual and treated properly with courtesy, dignity and respect. So this isn't just about getting a set of specialist services right. This is about getting the full range of NHS services right so that they're right at any time. But there are times when you will need more specialised services. And what we do know about that is that we've not been very good at making those timely. So some of the waiting times have been far too long. And I think that it's a real breakthrough that we've now committed to moving towards 18 weeks. As for all the other services we deliver. And I think we just need to recognise that won't be easy. I'm not making excuses. I hope I'm not making excuses. But in order to, the sort of, particularly the surgical services are very complex. They require a huge amount of skill. They'll be delivered by a very small number of surgeons will have that skill set at the moment. And therefore, in order to redress this, we need to work with the people, the educators, the trainers, and it's great to have people here today from the colleges to say, how can we actually go about that? Because it isn't just a question of going, well, here's some more money so that we can bring the waiting times down, and because it's about training and expertise and making sure that we've got the right workforce to deliver the services. So that's one really important part. I think that another important part is access to services, and patients who I'm struggling here because what I don't want to do, I really do not want to say the wrong word and cause any offence. I'm trying really hard not to do so, so if you'll bear with me on that. If you go to the doctors with something that is very common, like a cough or a cold or maybe a broken arm, then you rightly and absolutely expect that doctor to know a lot about that because it's what they deal with all the time. I was a GP myself, and for those sorts of things, then you know a lot. If it's something that turns up on your doorstep less frequently, then we can't expect every GP to know a lot about the service that individual patient needs. It's not possible. So for something very rare, then GPs will not be hugely experienced in dealing with that. But actually what we do know is that they should have a basic level of understanding. Every GP should have a basic level of understanding of all the spectrum of things, that spectrum of illnesses, the spectrum of, and that's why I don't want to call this an illness because I know it's not, but the spectrum of things that patients may come with to talk to them about through their door. And I, again, have heard from you is that actually we've got issues with GPs either just not knowing enough to even start the conversation, or almost not wanting to have that conversation. And we've got to do something about that. But that is a very significant cultural issue, and it's a long-term change, and it's an educational change. So again, we're not going to be able to resolve that overnight. But what I would expect in general practice, and certainly, my memory of patients came to see me, they had something with which I wasn't very familiar, and they needed treatment. I would hope that I knew enough at that first contact. But the next thing you want to see is the right attitude, where somebody then goes away and says, actually, I don't know enough at the moment. Will you come back and see me in a couple of days, and I'll know a lot more? And again, I remember hearing a story from one young man at one of the other meetings where he'd had a GP who had done exactly that, and he'd found that a very satisfactory interaction. The fact that this GP admitted in the first instance that she didn't really know as much as she would want to is great. But what we do know is that we've got an awful lot of GPs out there, and an awful lot of them are not in that position at the moment. They don't necessarily have the right basic knowledge and understanding, and some of them, sadly, do not have the right approach and attitude. And that, it's a terrible thing in the NHS. The health service, it has to be the one place whereby everybody should be treated as an individual. Everybody should be able to have any contact with anybody in their health service and be treated with courtesy, and maintain their dignity and be treated with respect. So that's something that, again, will take a long time, and we'll need many of the people in this room to help us with. NHS England can't do it alone. But then what we need to do, as well as that first contact, I know that this isn't just about surgical interventions and having the right number of surgeons trained, the right number of centres. Again, I know it's an issue that the centres aren't desperately well spaced around the country. There aren't many people are having to travel too far for treatment, so we need to look into that and see what we can do about it. But again, it is always difficult when you want to kind of concentrate expertise, because there's no doubt that the concentration of expertise is what gets you great clinical results. And yet you're always having to balance that to how much do we concentrate this clinical expertise, and how much do you balance that against the inconvenience for patients that they're having to travel a long way. But again, one of the other things I've heard is that, that all the support services that go around, and that for those patients who do want to undergo treatment, and even those who don't, do we have the right sort of psychological and other support services locally appropriate and easily accessible for everyone? So, as commissioners, we've got a very, very long way to go, and I recognise that, and I'm very grateful, because I think, looking at the journey over the last couple of years, I think we have had a good amount of contact, and you as a group have been one of the most informative and helpful groups that I think I've ever worked with, in genuinely being here to say, actually, this needs to change, not just to complain, but to try and help us move things on. So I think today is really important. I'm sorry I can't stay. You all knew I was going to say that, didn't you? You all knew I was going to say, I'm really sorry I can't stay. I'm going to start off. But I really hope that today works well for everybody, because there are a lot of real experts in the room. Not only expert patients, expert individuals, but there are expert professionals in the room. And those expert professionals, they're significant and senior players across a broad range of healthcare organisations. And by the end of today, I think it's absolutely imperative that we've moved to not just sort of NHS England being committed to being a better commissioner, but for these very, very important organisations across the NHS, and the people who are leading them and representing them today can work with you so that they can then go back to these organisations and say, this is how we play our part. Because there is a part for everybody to play. There is a part for providers, there is a part for the educators, there is a part for the Royal Colleges. There's a huge range of people in this room who can go away and make things better. I know they wouldn't be here unless they're absolutely committed to do that. But the time and effort that everybody spends today to get it right, I hope will be really worthwhile. And I think today might well be a more important day than any of the ones we've run so far in NHS England on transgender and non-binary issues. So I hope you have a great day, and I hope it's not too hot.
Just before Barbara speaks away, has anybody got any immediate questions or comments without it turning into a massive open forum before we move through to the next thing? Any immediate reflections on that? Jen? Oh, sorry, microphone.
Yes, I just wanted to say too, it is that spirit of cooperation we need and working together, because that's how you move the issues on. We've done some work in Wales with Welsh Public Health that brought up screening for older trans people. And even if that only saves a couple of lives, that was an amazing piece of work and shows what can be done when you as the commissioners and us as the community work together.
Thanks, Jenny. Nick?
Thank you very much. That was really helpful. I wonder if you could just clarify for us. I think we were given to believe at the last consultation meeting that there would be additional funding for surgery, for the surgical aspects of the specialist gender pathway. Can you confirm that there'll be extra funding for the gender identity clinics?
I'm probably going to struggle to answer that question, to be honest, because of the level of detail. What I do know is that NHS England has finished its consultation, and that on those things which are as a priority, because I think there are two aspects to your question here, and I wish I had somebody with me who was closer to it. So to answer your question, is there somebody here who can? One is about the prioritisation, and that's still underway, because that process isn't complete. In fact, we've got a specialised commissioning committee this afternoon. But if the other is just about general changes, yes, brilliant, thank you.
So it's absolutely right in terms of...
Will, can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm Will Huxter. I'm Director of Specialised Commissioning for NHS England in London, and I chair the Gender Task and Finish group that we have within NHS England. So just to confirm the first piece, which is absolutely we've invested more money this year for gender surgery, and the cap on that has been the capacity of providers. So the challenge about how quickly we can get towards 18 weeks has been that. We took a report on the surgical position to the last meeting of the Specialised Commissioning Oversight Group, which is the key body within NHS England where we look at this. And we raised there the challenge around waiting times for gender identity clinics. So I've been asked to come back to a future meeting with a plan about how we tackle that as well. So we've recently commissioned a piece of analysis going to visit each of the GICs to look at the particular bottlenecks and problems, and that's going to inform what we do. But absolutely, it's a commitment to tackling that as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Will. So can we pick up some of this in the conversations later as well? Because I think one of the key things that Will said there is actually one of the challenges is around clinical capacity. So actually just throwing money at it doesn't solve the fact you don't have people in the system to do the jobs, which is one of the conversations we need to pick up later as we move through this morning. Any other reflections or questions for Barbara before we let her disappear? Just one at the back. Keris is on her way.
My name's Rachel Ridley. I'm a staff nurse, and I'm on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing. Just a comment you were saying about doctors and having concerns, that the dignity and respect echoes throughout the health professions, not just doctors. Some nurses have problems with it as well. And I've been a recipient, a patient, and I've received bad nursing and very excellent nursing, both in the private sector and in the independent sector and in the NHS. So let's just be aware of that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and absolutely fair comment. I think one of the things that I was the most distressed about was the kind of what I was hearing about GPs. And I think I kind of picked that up as a personal thing, but you're absolutely right. It's all clinical professionals. It's not just the clinical professionals either. It's what's really important is how all the people in a healthcare setting environment treat you, because you can, the receptionist or the lady on the outpatient desk can be just as difficult. In fact, yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we'll go to Nick, and then we're going to move on.
Hello, Barbara. I'm Nick Bray. I'm actually my trading name is Transgender Information, but I do a fair bit of work working alongside NHS England in various guises. And I just wonder, one of the things that seems to be coming out quite a bit is there are some concerns about how long the Task and Finish group is actually going to continue, because it's one of the things that seems to be, along with the board itself, is driving this forward. And it's quite keen how long we're going to remain sort of up there and have
And I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry, moving forward, because I'm deaf, which is this always quite difficult for me. But what I will commit to, I don't know whether Will knows the question. Frankly, why would you stop a task and finish group if the task wasn't finished? I think it's really important if you have a task and finish group, the task finishing does stop, because otherwise it just becomes a meeting that everybody goes to. But I think if there is something that needs to, it might be slightly different. So maybe you need a task and finish group and the task is different, and one thing finishes and another one opens. But certainly, if there are still things to do, we will make sure that we have the right sort of forums, and you could perhaps take that back and make sure that's. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think what you've heard there from Barbara is a commitment from NHS England that the task isn't finished, and we need to be clear about the task, and we need to try and get it to a finish. And I think that's also part of the conversation for this morning's discussions about everybody's role in that task, because NHS England, as Barbara said, can't do it alone. So thank you very much, Barbara.
And thank you. Have a good day.
To one another, but in doing that, one of you is then going to be the voice of that table to say who's sat round that table. Yeah. So if you're on a tiny table, you might want to turn around and join a bigger table, or if you're on a huge table, you might want to disperse and equalise the numbers a little bit. But just in 2 minutes, say who you are and where you're from, and nominate somebody from your table to say to feed back to everybody to say who's on your table. Okay? Everybody looks terrified now. Okay, so 30 seconds warning if you haven't introduced yourself. Table. And because I'm stood right next to her, I'm going to ask Susan to go first. So I'm just going to ask you, what are the organisations and the people? Yeah.
Right, okay, let's start with Nick Douglas, who's here in various capacities and so on, involved in a variety of things. He didn't actually specify the things that he's involved in, but he's here in a personal capacity. And they've got Susanna, who's in fact sort of really representing sort of transgender issues in Wales, eh? Within the black community. Now, how did I get that wrong? There's a bit of a difference. And Joe Stringer, who's the Senior Communications Officer in the NHS, who will be spreading this far and wide. Okay? Okay, fantastic. So we just move on. So very briefly, who's around your table? Who's speaking for you?
It looks like it's me. I'm sitting with Helen and Felix, who are both involved in running support groups for young people and adult people who are binary, non-binary, trans. They also work as experts. Experts by experience.
Okay, we're not going for CVs.
No, okay, but all right.
And who are you?
They're very nice people.
They
I'm
are,
John
they're
Dean.
lovely.
I'm the CRG chair and
Excellent.
director of the Gender Clinic in Exeter.
Thank you. So no CVs. Who you are where from around your table?
Good morning. We've got Jeremy from NHS England Specialised Commissioning, Leanne Wilkinson from Health Watch Devon, Rafiq Tajbik from the RCGP, Carol Rees from NHS England, and myself, Tim Dolby, from the Information Governance Alliance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, follow that. Who's next? Table at the back.
So on our table we've got Louise, if I've said that correct, who's from Public Health England and is involved in managing LGBT programmes. Anna from Health Watch Dorset, which is taking focus on equality and diversity and community engagement. Steve, who's the Chief Inspector for CQC in general practice, and also began writing a paper about inequality and trans issues, but we're not sure what happened to it. We've got Oliver, who's from the Department of Health, and Keris, who's a project coordinator for the Task and Finish Group, and myself, Helen Greener, and I'm here as a representative from the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Thank you very much. Okay, where are we going next? Who's got the microphone?
We have Michelle, who is the co-founder of excuse me, Clinic Q, a sexual health clinic for trans people in Soho. We also have Samir, who's from the Race Equality Foundation, and Kay, who works for the UK Trans Info and also Non-Binary Inclusion Project, and Jude, who is a poet and a librarian, and here in a personal capacity to speak today about informed consent, among other things. And both myself, Yale, and my assistant director, Vicky, are from the General Medical Council, and I work in Standards and Ethics, which is the part that develops guidance for doctors on ethical issues.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And this table?
I'm Paul Howarth from the Government Equalities Office. On the table we also have Will Huckster, who's from NHS England, Liz Prendergast from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Nick Bray from Transgender Information, and Tanner Gibbons-Klein from Trans Healthcare Training.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Everybody should have a T-shirt with their organisation on. It makes it really easy. Angela?
Yes, that's fine. On our table, we've got Jason Stamp, who's the individual chair of the NHS England Assurance Group, so represents the patient voice. We've got 3 people from actually Olivia's team, so from the public participation team, 2 that work specifically on this area and have done right for the since the beginning, and Alice, so Mary and Angela. Alice Williams, who specialises in children and young people, actually at NHS England. I've then got Guy Thomas, who's a regional officer in the East Midlands region for the Royal College of Nursing, and Rachel Ridley, who's representing the Royal College of Nursing, is a staff nurse and an LGBT role model.
Thank you very much.
Okay, on our table we've got Ayaz Manji, is that correct? Excellent, thank you. And he's the policy officer from Stonewall, and we've also got Jenny Ann. Way too many different hats to actually mention, but trans activist, unique, sparkle, there's other highlights there, but I'm sure everyone knows Jenny. And myself, Tara Stone, I'm a trans development and support worker for Train Trans.
Cool, thank you very much. James?
On this table, we've got Steve Hamer, who's a commissioner involved in this from NHS England, Christina Richards, who is representing the president of the British Psychological Society, Matthew Mills, representing the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, Leighton Seal, representing the Royal College of Physicians, and me, James Barrett, representing the British Association of Gender Identity Specialists.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And Will?
On our table, we've got Bernard Reid and Terry Reid from Gender Identity Research Education Society, which is GIRES. We have Zoe Playden from the University of London, and Francis from NHS England, and myself, Will Cox from Mermaids and Generate Support Group.
Fantastic. So actually, I don't think I've been in a room ever with that diversity of expertise from Royal Colleges, the equalities dimensions, different regulators and commissioners. So I think there is an enormous amount of assets in this room today that if we can't come up with some good ideas and solutions and ways to collaborate about moving forwards, nobody can. So there's your challenge. We want to set this in a little bit of context, and Zoe Playden has really kindly agreed to kick us off with a little bit of a story about the sort of the societal and the cultural journey that we think would be just really helpful to put our minds into a place about how we think about some of these experiences. Yeah, cool.
Yep. And if you could bring up the presentation form.
Okay, that's you.
Okay. Thank you. We will all be familiar with these key dates in the cultural history of trans people. Ironically, almost as soon as gay men were depathologized and decriminalized in 1967, male homosexuality was...
Is mine working? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Is that better? Great. Let me start again. We'll all be familiar with these key dates in the cultural history of trans people. And I think it's interesting that, ironically, almost as soon as gay men were depathologized and decriminalized in 1967, male homosexuality was, in effect, re-psychopathologized and recriminalized by being transferred to trans women in the April Ashley case's diagnosis. Culturally, homophobia became institutionalized transphobia, so that in 1970, trans people lost their civil identity, human rights and employment rights. In the last 20 years, however, it has become evident that we're dealing with a somatic condition, not a mental disorder. In the last 3 years, then, there have been widespread demands for psychiatry to withdraw from the treatment of trans people, from the highest levels of UK and European government, by national and international human rights organisations, and by the trans communities themselves. Stonewall's recent apology and inclusivity report models best practice and is much appreciated. So these political demands have been supported by a generation of social change in academic research, medical education, scientific knowledge, UK legislation, and not least in the NHS itself, concurrently with successful legal action by the trans community to regain our human rights. These, though, are the key issues at present. GICs continue to operate as a kind of secret garden, producing standards of care based on a typical patient narrative legally determined at a historical point in time, 45 years ago, in the April Ashley case, now out of date and invalid, but nevertheless maintained by circular argument from revolving door experts. I mean, it's the same people who write the standards, who write the reports, who provide the treatment and get paid for doing all three. This means there are very obvious points of direct discrimination in treatment and a high legal risk for the NHS, UK government, the Royal Colleges, especially the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and for individual clinicians themselves. Not only do current care pathways fail to keep pace with social change, but trans history from 1950 onwards meets the definition of a eugenic project. Psychopathologization, compulsory sterilization, loss of all civil liberties and legal rights, social exclusion, absence of support from established civil liberties groups, and omission from the public health record. Hopefully, our aim today is to help remedy these healthcare inequities and thereby manage the risk to all concerned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Any immediate reflections on that? Because I think Zoe said a little bit of that at the last Gender Identity Network, and a lot of that is the understanding the journey that we're on, and all understanding the same journey. So I know there's lots of conversation going on Twitter at the moment about, we've heard all this before, we know all of this, we know all this already, why are you just restating the problems? Actually, do we all understand that same journey? Have we all thought about it? And have we shared that conversation together? Because I don't think that we have. I've not experienced that in terms of Government Equalities Office and the Human Rights Commission being in the same room as CQC and NHS England to have a shared conversation. So this is as much about bringing professionals and people involved in the service along this journey as it is about trans people who've personal experience of this journey. So any reflections? And then we're going to move on to John.
I'm Rafiq from the RCGP. I really liked what you said about the drawbacks of having a typical patient narrative. For me, it would be, what would you replace that with? If you're commissioning a service, or if you're trying to work out resource, don't you need to have an average? I agree it has to be tailorable, but for me, you know, who else would you get but people who are treating trans patients to help try and work out what the average patient actually has to experience, and then make sure there's flexibility in the system? Maybe I've misunderstood what you were saying.
No, you haven't misunderstood it at all. And that's a very helpful question. I think the problem is that since 1970, everyone has been trying to patch up an increasingly leaky ship. And I think the point is it won't sail anymore. So we have to start from new, we have to start to rebuild. I can talk to individuals about managing risk outside this forum, of course, but my broad advice would be to say the best option is to stop thinking of trans as anything other than a somatic, asymptomatic intersex condition. Start with that. We have a somatic condition. Some people are born symptomatically intersex, that's to say, you can see the intersex at birth. Other people aren't. If we start to think of trans as that kind of somatic condition, which is what all of the evidence suggests, and even in 1970, 3 out of the 5 medical experts at the Ashley case were clear that she had an intersex condition. The judge preferred evidence from the 2 that dissented. If you start a narrative there, then what we've got is a narrative that says, well, okay, we don't need psychiatry to be a gatekeeper. That's a very ambiguous role anyway, because how can you have a proper therapeutic relationship when you have this massive power over people? Basically, we're dealing with something which is as somatic as any other somatic condition, and challenging, and has a range of destinations. As soon as you think of intersex, we automatically include non-binary people. We have no idea how many people have been forced from one binary male into another binary female because that was the only option. The requirement of the patient narrative was that that was what people said in order to get access to any kind of care. Many people might have preferred to stay somewhere in the middle. Non-binary people have, in effect, been elided. So as soon as we say, okay, we've got a narrative that says we're treating a somatic intersex condition, some people will choose and consent for counselling support, but again, we don't need psychiatric support. We can save a lot of money by using experienced counselling. We've removed the gatekeeper role of psychiatry because it's not a psychiatric disorder or illness. And we can then start to address the inequities that I list there, and those are where your immediate risks lie. A woman wanting elective bilateral mastectomy as risk-reducing surgery because she has a history of breast cancer has one interview,
to assure that she's able to consent and she's got appropriate patient education. A man who wants elective bilateral mastectomy because, as I would say, they're intersex, they're trans, has to spend years in psychiatric assessment. And even then, the surgeon at the end might make a completely separate psychiatric assessment. This is what the Royal College guidelines allow for, and refuse the surgery themselves. Elective prescription of HRT. Every other woman who comes to a GP and decides on the basis of consent and education that they want HRT has a right to it. My GP can refuse to give me HRT just at whim with no reason. Direct discrimination. Every other child in the country is considered to be Gillick competent, except trans children. They're not allowed to elect for blockers, whatever they want. Why? Why is suddenly being trans a second-class status?
Okay.
And fundamentally, we're not operating to consent and choice. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
You're going into the content of the workshop discussion,
Okay.
but you have got everybody in the room slightly wrapped, I think.
It was a terribly helpful question. Thank you.
It was. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move us on. Thank you very much for that, Zoe. And John's going to give us a perspective of the sort of, I suppose, the specialist pathway and the story from a clinic's lens and the issues that Zoe's come through with. Are issues that we need to get into the depth of in the conversations that we have in the workshop shortly. John, what have you done to it?
Well, I found a slide which wasn't mine, but I've got the right one now. Yes, Olivia. Well, good morning. My name's John Dean. By background, I worked as a general practitioner in a single-handed inner city practice in Plymouth for 11 years, and I've worked with people with concerns over gender and sexuality for nearly 30 years. I now work exclusively in clinical practice with gender issues in the NHS. My task today is to give you the perspective from the chair of the Clinical Reference Group. The Clinical Reference Group is tasked by NHS England to help develop products, service specification policy, quality measures, offer advice, scan the horizon for problems. The horizon is pretty well filled at the moment. We've found plenty of things to look at. I'm talking about trans healthcare, but what I'm actually talking about is healthcare. Healthcare for people. Healthcare with the people who have a slightly different gender past. And there's an awful lot of them out there. The Equality and Human Rights Commission found that around 1% of the population in England was gender variant to some extent. And that actually is over 500,000 people who have some degree of gender variance, gender incongruence. Not all of them will seek to transition. These people may be very happy in their lives and not need to experience gender dysphoria and seek any help from medicine or elsewhere. What I would say, though, is that the narrative which Zoe described is changing. It's ever progressing. Standards of care may well have been based on an old narrative, but we know now we're seeing many more trans men coming forward and seeking help, and also people with non-binary experiences of gender, which includes people who experience no gender. Their healthcare needs perhaps fall into three phases. I think only in one of these phases do specialist gender identity clinics get any, are they involved? And that is in this area here, in the area where people have been able to self-identify and affirm what they want to do with their lives and are making choices about how they might wish to adapt their body, their social role in order to live a happy and contented life. Most of the time, their healthcare needs are managed by other people in the health and care sector. Before they get to a gender clinic, it is their family practitioner, their general practitioner, who may be their first port of call when asking for affirmation of their self-identification, recognition of the validity of their experience, and acceptance of them as a person with a gender incongruence. I absolutely, from my own perspective, acknowledge trans people as having a neurodevelopmental difference, not a disorder or a disease, and not a mental health problem. A neurodevelopmental difference, an intersex of the brain, if you like. For some people, it is necessary for them, in order to achieve comfort and happiness in life, to make some form of transition, but not for all. During that period, specialist services are important. But out of someone's, let's say, 70 years and 10, we're not being very generous there, they're spending perhaps 3 years with a gender identity clinic and 67 years, or more, we hope, with the rest of the health service as we strive for happier and longer and more fulfilling lives. And as such, the responsibility to help them enjoy a happy, full, productive life lays in other parts of the NHS. And these are the bits, as chair of the clinical reference group, I can't influence that. I can tell my colleagues at NHS England Specialised Commissioning, we need more help from primary care, we need more help from secondary care, but actually it's other bits of the NHS. It's not just the NHS, it also involves regulators, it involves royal colleges as well, who need to take action. And that's my appeal to you, to try and take action to help us deal with these bits that we can't influence. Now, there at the moment, just a brief resume of what we do. I'm not going to talk much about the specialised service, but there are seven specialist gender identity clinics in England. The largest and the longest established in the world is the one West London Mental Health Trust, and there are other clinics not very evenly distributed around the country. These clinics have evolved over 40 years without much central planning, and quite independently of each other. They mainly developed from the personal interest of an individual practitioner, and like Topsy have tended to grow and grow. As a consequence of that, they have different professional mixes in their multidisciplinary teams, and the training of the people who work in those clinics, who are not just doctors. There are clinical psychologists, speech and language therapists, nurses, social workers, other health professionals, psychotherapists, other health professionals who contribute to those teams. It varies by clinic, but much of their training is by apprenticeship. As such, it's quite difficult to suddenly increase the number of professionals available, because there isn't a training pathway, a career structure for clinicians who want to work in gender clinics, in order that we can train and recruit and expand our services adequately to meet demand. Clinics have distinct operational policies and practices, but we all are commissioned by NHS England to deliver services which are consistent with the good practice guidelines on the assessment of management of gender dysphoria in adults, which was published in 2013. Now, with another part of today, we're going to talk about standard of care model versus the informed consent model. Most British medical practice, I would put to you, is driven by standards of care, whether they come from NICE or from professional organisations like the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which produces this standard of care document, or the intercollegiate standards of care, which were hosted by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, but are actually a corporate project of a number of different organisations. It is upon these standards that, for right or wrong, that the interim protocol, which defines what is commissioned in the NHS in specialised services, it's based upon those that the services that specialist clinics and surgery providers operate. Now, the wider NHS is the bit that I would love to be able to influence and encourage and to help us deliver healthcare for people with a different gender past, but who are essentially people, and there are lots of them out there who are just people. There's quite considerable variation in engagement in the wider NHS with regard to trans healthcare. Now, whether you're in primary care, or working in a hospital service as a gynecologist or a general surgeon, there are some clinicians who are highly proactive and supportive and have taken responsibility to learn about trans health and not just the health issues, but the social and cultural issues that underpin our approach to health, and take appropriate responsibility for several aspects of healthcare. In my experience as a clinical director in a gender service, the great majority of general practitioners that I work with are accepting and empathic of trans people. They're often not very knowledgeable because it's not a part of their standard training, and they may make fundamental errors which trans people may find offensive. Within their teams, other members of the team, ranging from the receptionist using the wrong pronoun to a practice manager saying you can't change your gender sex marker on your medical records without a gender recognition certificate, without all these things. And Olivia's looking, so I must hurry up. There are training needs, but generally speaking, the great majority of clinicians, people working in primary care and secondary care, want to help, but need help through training and educational opportunities. There are a minority of clinicians who are opposed to providing trans health care for a range of reasons. Sometimes they cite lack of knowledge. This is too specialised, don't know anything about it, and haven't learned anything about it, don't plan to learn anything about it soon. Some people find that believe that trans healthcare is something which should not be part of standard services, but something that should be commissioned separately and contracted with an additional payment. And there are also, sadly, still a small minority of clinicians and others who have a moral objection to trans people. Trans people just want to get on with their lives. Whether they're binary or non-binary trans, they just want to live contentedly within society and with respect to their gender past, often unnoticed by society. Most trans people don't want to be activists. Thank God for the activists, because life would be more difficult for them otherwise. Everyone's gender journey, if they're born with gender incongruence, their journey is different, but there are certain commonalities. After transition, healthcare needs are actually not markedly different from those of other people. So apart from that small period where they're with us, their healthcare needs generally are similar to the rest of the community. After transition and surgery, the great majority experienced improved psychological, emotional and social well-being and stable or improved physical health. They also live productive lives after transition and are integrated within society, do not experience more mental health problems or use mental health services much more frequently than other people. That's my perspective from the CRG. Please help us outside specialist services to make it right for trans people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'm not going to stop for questions. John, you did really well to try and stay to time. I'm impressed. We've got a series of kind of personal stories and experiences that people have really kindly agreed to share with us that we're going to run through. We're going to pause after each one of those those conversations just for some immediate reflections, really, about what's impacted on you. What have you actually heard from what people have said? So I think we're going to start with Jude. It's fine, and I will come and give you a microphone. So we're going to start with Jude, and then we're going to move on to Susan, and then Felix and Helen are going to do a double act, and then Nick's going to finish us off and try and pull some of the threads of what everybody's said together. But if we go with Jude first. Okay?
Hi, my name is Jude Orlando Angera. I'm 30. I'm a poet. I'm a librarian. Words I would use to describe myself, my gender experience and expression are boy with an I or a Y, demi-boy, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, gender non-conforming, androgynous, femme, and probably others I haven't discovered yet. My gender identity is in flux. My self-knowledge is constantly evolving, but the one constant that has always been there is my discomfort with my body, and especially my discomfort with the way my body is perceived in society, the way people point at me and say female. Well, I need to fix that. What I want is top surgery. What keeps being pushed to me is bottom surgery and testosterone. Now, to speak about my journey to try and get top surgery, I was eventually referred to Nottingham Gender Clinic, and having heard many horror stories from other non-binary and gender non-conforming people about gender clinics being quite kind of binary focused and prescriptive about appearance and behaviour, Nottingham especially, I did what a lot of trans people feel the need to do, and I played a part. So I went in pretending to be kind of a binary trans man rather than myself. Unsurprisingly, the psychiatrists that were assessing me found inconsistencies between the story I was telling and everything else about me. Pressed, I was finally honest about my gender identity and even tried to present a bit more femme, a bit more androgynous. And it was at that point that all the horror stories I'd heard came true. The psychiatrists at Nottingham Gender Clinic, they said at my third appointment that they wouldn't be able to say yes or no to all I wanted, which is top surgery, no testosterone, no other treatment, without seeing a non-binary gender specialist for an indeterminate number of sessions at kind of great financial and kind of psychological cost to myself, because they kept focusing on my mental health, especially my history of trauma as a survivor, and my being non-binary, which they said, raised my chances of regretting any transition, and also the being non-binary and my wishes for transition not fitting the acceptable kind of transgender narratives and pathways for transition. Now, about trauma, luckily I started questioning gender kind of when I was a child, so way before any trauma ever happened to me. So I didn't get the usual, trauma made you trans, which I have heard a lot. But instead, I was told by the gender identity clinic practitioners that once I got over my trauma, I might regret my transition choices. And the thing is, I am not just going to get over my trauma. I can learn to cope with it, but it's not going to happen. And ultimately, whether my trauma came first or whether my identifying as trans came first is irrelevant. They're things that coexist. My trauma doesn't define me or affect my ability to make choices about my body. About regret, I feel that this is something that gets often touted as a reason to deny and delay people's treatment when it's A, actually quite rare, B, often about systemic transphobia that people experience kind of before, during and after transition, especially kind of within medical and transition services themselves, rather than the trans person making a mistake about who they are. And is also likely preventable by making transition a less never-ending humiliating ordeal, which it currently is. And regarding the acceptable versus unacceptable narratives and pathways, the story that a lot of us feel like we have to conform to kind of have a chance at successfully surviving a gender clinic are the born this way narrative, the trapped in the wrong body narrative, and the full transition and passing kind of as holy grail and end goal. Whereas things that I know exist because they either apply to myself or people I know are things like becoming or choosing to be trans, trans people who don't experience dysphoria, or trans people who don't hate themselves or their body, trans people who are okay or proud of being visibly trans, people who are non-binary and or gender non-conforming, and transition wishes like mine that go against the HRT top surgery, bottom surgery pathway that is accepted. My proposed solutions to this regard mental health support, abolishing the real life experience and the informed consent model. Mental health support should be available alongside transition for trans people who wish to access it, not wait to decide who is trans/stable enough to transition at all. Real life experience is cruel and unnecessary. We as trans people already do it every day just by existing as ourselves. And all the real-life experience does is force trans people to pass according to an arbitrary, binary, outdated definition of male and female, without giving us any of the tools that would help us pass, such as hormones or surgery. And also is actually incredibly dangerous because it helps people at home and at work and in society, which is actively dangerous and does kill a lot of us. And as for the informed consent model, which is the last thing I'm going to say, really all we're asking is for you to give trans people the information we need about procedures to enable us to make informed decisions about our own bodies. You need to focus on the real life trans person in front of you rather than, whatever history of trauma they may not or may not have, or the hypothetical regret they may have in 20 years' time, because you need to focus on keeping people alive now because we are at risk. Respect us as human beings with agency and we might actually trust you.
Jude, thank you very much. Any immediate reflections, thoughts that provokes in people hearing Jude talk?
Good morning, my name's Guy Thomas, I'm from the Royal College of Nursing. I think there is always the dilemma around real life experience and lived experience, and I think for all the right reasons services have been trapped into requesting this from individuals they work with, but actually they don't see the bigger societal picture. I think if you look at someone who is trying to transition or move along a position of a gender continuum, and you force them into a certain dynamic that they physically cannot present in, apologies, I'm going to be a little contentious, this could be almost considered a form of secondary assault. You're putting them in a very vulnerable position in a non-accepting society. Now, I think lots of gender services really, really recognise that now. So I think the forcing into boxes is much, much, much more less frequently experienced, but it's very sad to hear that it is. But it's about thinking, let's look at criteria, but let's look at what the individual is physically having to do 24/7 on the streets of our cities and rural communities, and whether you can expect someone that, physically cannot, very complex and sometimes troubling phrase, pass, and forcing them to go and put themselves into a vulnerable situation in society. A comparator would be, would we want our friends and families being forced into communities that they know they will not only not be accepted in, but actually could be affected by physical assault or verbal violence. So it's a journey. I think we are very, very well and truly on that journey, but it's about thinking about real life implications for people when they're not in your room, they're not in your consult.
Jenny Ann Bishop from Transforum. I think it shows yet again a huge need for education and awareness, and I'm aware there's some organisations here today who do that. So really please listen and learn.
So one last comment from Rachel.
My reflection is that people need to realise that you are an individual and you don't tick all the boxes. I'm a human being and I'm an individual, and that's what you need to remember.
Thanks, Rachel. And thank you again, Jude. So we're going to move on to hear from Susan, who's got some slides as well.
Right, thank you very much indeed, and so on. I want to the title of this is A Path of My Own. I want to start off by saying that one area of research work I've been involved in, as you might gather from my accent, is the development of personal identity in tribal conflict situations where violence occurs. That work has been done, in fact, in Northern Ireland with academic support, and I have also been using this and applying this work to questions on the development of gender identity and personal identity. And a couple of things I just mentioned before I go on. You've probably heard of the work of Dawkins and so on, but you may not have heard of the work of Galais and Gerard. The whole question of mirror neurons, the sort of contagious, self-reinforcing driving forces which take place at that time. You will have heard, of course, of the traditional psychodynamic theories and so on. There's very little work done on linking the two. And in fact, this is one of the areas that I've been dealing with. Now, psychodynamic theories depend on cognitive abilities. Those don't really develop until the age of 2 years, when in fact the prefrontal cortex of the brain develops. That means that during those first 2 years, learning processes are driven by the physiological driving forces, those self-reinforcing forces that take place. So if we're looking at personality development, if we're looking at gender and so on, and we take off from birth, we take on with a particularly strong driving force, which in fact you cannot fight, because if you try to fight it, you get into a cycle which goes round and round. And that, of course, is in the end what leads to collapse. Now, what I want to do, in fact, is, as it were, talk through my own story. I've got a series of slides here, and I will just talk to the themes of the slides because there isn't the time. But, of course, the slides can be made available for more detail. And if I start with my story, first of all, start with the standard one, suppression. How many people have gone through this? You sort of try to fight it, you try to sort of suppress it, you do everything like that until you reach the age of 29 years in my case. And then I reached the point where collapse virtually occurred, or nearly occurred. And I had to make a choice. Now, I had to try and continue to fight it, in which case I would have gone on through and so on. But I actually tried to turn things round. So instead of dealing with that, I put up this slide which says seeking direction. I tried to explore where this was leading me. It was a nightmare because, of course, gender is just one aspect of a multifaceted part of life. Gender and sexual orientation go their different ways. So if you move towards transition, if you move towards changing your role, you may create replace one set of conflicts with another. But of course, given is this microphone going off? Given the driving force that actually is behind that, it is usually gender that will win. So to deal with this, I literally had to try to invert my approach. So I had to accept that that picture at the top of those slides really is me. To try to transcend them, to look at the richness and the potential that's involved. The significance about that is it doesn't diminish the conflict, but instead of striking at the bottom where it can destroy you, it strikes at the top. And that is what that is what I found. So how did I deal with this? It was a process of inversion. And what were the implications? I think a number of things were that, as far as I was concerned, it led to the situation, simple acceptance is not enough. You've got to use what it means in a positive way. And I think the best way I can say is that perhaps mentally and socially I have transitioned, but I have chosen to live in a way which encompasses both binary roles. And what that did was give me a sense of esteem and security, which meant that it gave me a much more secure base to help me deal with the conflicts that I faced. And then moved on from that. And I think that just this slide here says what a lot of us say. I never wanted to be a woman. The feeling that I ought to be a woman has been with me for most of my life. But it's not to be a woman, it's to be myself. And that's basically what we're looking at. And if we look at what I talked about, the background, the conflicts of gender are seen to be a failure to build a coherent sense of self-identity. They're the symptom of that failure rather than the cause. And although many transsexuals urgently seek reassignment, that can be the driving force. The real target to address for management is the rejection of the current identity and role. And that is, if you look at the early formation, that is what the physiological processes lead you to take up. The dynamics, I've actually covered this slide, but I think just to note that, in fact, this has been an analysis of personality development, and gender dysphoria has been used as a case study to link the two approaches. So I'm not going in and looking at gender dysphoria. We're looking at personality development across the links that take place across there. And one of the conclusions for that is that instead of looking for causes or reasons, the need is to manage the dynamics instead. So the way I've dealt with that is, in fact, really to treat it as an alcoholism would treat drink. Because you cannot, you're dealing with fundamentals which are fixed in terms of gender identity. And sort of by doing that, that is something that can happen. But there are limitations to that approach. And I think one of the basic limitations that you find is that, first of all, if you're talking about alcoholism, it leads towards destruction and death. What am I doing? I'm using this approach to sort of resist what could be regarded as a fulfillment of life. That is much more difficult. It doesn't let me do anything. It only allows me to do what is right. And what I found when I took that, it was so successful that I seemed to be clear of the conflict for 14 years. Another crisis then occurred. I was distancing myself from it, and I realized that I could not abstain. I had to find a way to express my gender identity the way I'm doing now. So that has been the situation and the approach. And basically, it's only a management method. The conflict still continues. I'm keeping a truce. And while gender identity remains constant throughout life, others change with commitments and time. And that means that I have to be able to accept and manage change whenever it's required. So to sum up, the approach is really that I've taken is not to deny or prevent change. It's to make smooth change possible so that if it's needed, it come at the right time, for the right reasons, in a way which minimises the trauma it creates. It's not an easy course. I try to be open about my approach, and I've kept to this approach for the last 40 years. So that's the approach that I adopted. There are future concerns. Obviously, as age increases, the pressure grows stronger as commitments diminish, and ideals for the future give way to the realities of the past. So I have to keep the possibility and freedom to say, I will perhaps transition, I seek gender reassignment, and that always has to be kept open, otherwise the fear of entrapment with age destroys the sort of approach that you're taking. There's also the trauma of living two lives, the cloud of unknowing because of this approach. I cannot and must not predict what the future will bring. So that's that's my pathway, that's my route. What actually happened in the context of trying to seek professional help? Two occasions. I saw a consultant who specialised in this area in Harley Street in 1976. That didn't go very far because he wasn't prepared to listen to me. He was only prepared to tell me what I should do. The last time I talked to a consultant in the Gender Identity Clinic, he told me he had never met anybody like me before. Whether that's true or not is another matter. And because of this, I have not sought to seek help because I have felt that there's little that people could offer me in taking this approach. And the fact that we're talking about these issues today suggests that not a great deal has changed. So that's broadly speaking, where I stand. Now, I mentioned research. There are a couple of slides here which give this area. I'll just go through these because there's one here. It's information. There's one here, in fact, on religious impact. That in fact, says why the church's teaching on gender and sexuality, cannot be correct. It says, in fact, it shows that it arose because of the need to gain respectability in Greco-Roman society. It is not the teaching that Christianity originally had. And the incalculable harm that has been done by the way the church has manipulated its own gospel cannot be underestimated. So that is dealt with in that. There are two other articles coming out, in fact, which I'm just about finishing, which, in fact, one is about my personal story in more detail, and another one, in fact, is in fact personality development and gender. Why we should rethink the process. When I'll be sort of giving details on this. So those are the things. Now, those are the research topics. If we look at sort of pathway presumptions, I mean, basically there's an increasing recognition of the non-binary situations. We know that. But the assumption tends to be made that people in a situation are automatically seeking to live in a non-binary role. That is not always the case. John has talked about the wide variety of experience. If we look at the guidance of the general petitions on the Royal College of Physicians website, there's a great value of a great deal of value in the material that's presented, but the advice which is given almost exclusively relates to transition, to medical treatment and things like that. UK good practice and WPATH guides reinforce the assumption. And basically all the pathways I've been offered made that presumption. All of them would have destroyed the truce, which balances the aspects of my identity which build on my relationships against the selfhood which is created by gender inside. So, in terms of looking for pathways, I have got a particular role, but other people have talked about this. But there are many people who are struggling with their own transgender experiences, who in fact are undergoing tremendous struggles, but never reach the point where it would seem that going to a gender identity clinic is correct. Physicians and so on have little understanding. And those who eventually do go may have taken damaging action which compromises any sort of truce that they otherwise wish to obtain. And in fact, as someone said earlier, the danger is that people will be forced along a typical patient pathway which leads to transition, when in fact proper management should help establish the full range of pathways that are available. So, recommendations. Pathways are needed which do not deny or prevent change, but must also recognise those things which ought to be preserved. They should aim to make a smooth change possible, so that if it is needed, it can come at the right time, for the right reasons, and in a way that minimises the trauma it creates. Ease of access and referral should be available, and also be known to be available at the earliest possible stage to those who are struggling with gender dysphoria in their lives. And the perception that GICs are always about transition and reassignment need to be removed.
Thank you very much, Susan. So, any immediate thoughts or reflections on what that raises for you, what Susan said?
Hi. Well, I kind of think there's one of the points that I wanted to get out after having listened to two people's narratives so far is, for everyone in here, there's 100, there's 1,000 narratives. One of the things that we haven't got is we haven't got a firm basis to actually explain, and that's kind of been mentioned already, you know, what is the trans question? And I think one of the problems that we still have, we see it in our media, we see it in our society, is we're still saying, what is the trans question? We're a question. Can we get past the question, please? Some people are trans. Get over it.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, so I think we'll move on. Thank you very much, Susan. To Felix and Helen, and we're going to do a double act. Is that fair enough to say? Yeah. Are you sitting down to do it, or are you coming up the front to do it? Don't argue about it, though.
No, we don't argue. We have to wait. Right, you'll start it. Oops. Sorry. Who's going to do the sign-up things?
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Olivia. Right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Felix, and this is Helen, my wife, who's currently fallen to bits, but we won't go into that. We're both fully post-operative transsexuals, the labels we prefer, who, as you can see from the slide in front of us now, not behind us, as our trans history, and our greatest passion is supporting others, whether they be non-binary, questioning their gender, transitioning, or post-operative. We co-run Trans Youth Hull and TPSG Hull Service User Group for adults, family and friends. We are both experts by experience with the Care Quality Commission and engage regularly with NHS England concerning the improvements of the trans clinical pathways and patient care engagement. Helen also works with Humberside Criminal Justice Board, Diversity Panel and Hull Adult Safeguarding Board and the University of Lincoln School of Health and Social Care as a Service User Development Officer. And I assist Helen during trans awareness training sessions at the university and other venues. We're now going to share our two very different stories of transition, one positive and one very negative, which show the importance of peer support, voluntary and grassroots organisations such as ours. Over to Helen.
Hiya. I'm going to start with my story first because mine was a negative one. It was quite a few years ago, but I don't want it to go back to there. This is the reason why I wanted to tell this story. When I came out in 1999, and I had a really, really good GP, actually, who provided really good care. I was sent from there to a sexual health specialist. And I was told that I would have to see him for 2 or 3 times before I could move on to go to the gender clinic. When I went to the first consultation, it was very insulting. He sort of insulted my ex-wife, because we was getting divorced, but we had 2 young children, so she was supporting me because the children still wanted to see me and things like that. He insulted her, he insulted me. He basically said to her that she was a butch lesbian with ulterior motives and a lot of other things. So I sort of after that, I came out of the consultation, and I said to my partner at the time, is he a pervert or am I? That's how he made me feel. So from there, I went to see my GP. I got an appointment to see my GP, and my GP actually put the complaint in with me, because I wrote down everything that had gone on. From there, I was given a consultation with a psychiatrist privately, which took about 6 weeks to get sorted, and everything went fine. Which was quite good. And then I had to wait for about 8 months before I could get to the gender clinic. I got to the gender clinic and I went into the consultation with the lead nurse specialist and the psychiatrist. And again, ended up sort of like being bullied and harassed, and because I told them that I was having a misalignment of my lower jaw corrected. They told me, no, you're not. You're not having anything done. Not until we say so. But that was already on the cards because the planning had been done, been 8 months planning that, with a specialist. And so that ended up in a stand-up row with me leaving the room, basically, being told by the psychiatrist and the lead nurse that I would never get hormones on the NHS. They'd make sure I'd never get that. And I would definitely not get surgery. So that was my first experience in the first few months. Obviously, this put a lot of stress on me. I lost a lot of weight. My blood pressure went through the roof. And in the end, my GP put me onto hormones. Once he put me on hormones and blockers and things, everything came back right. My blood pressure went down. I was feeling better. And he said, you don't have to go to the gender clinic, but by then, because I knew a number of other trans people by then as well, but by then I said, no, I'm going to take them on. So I continue to sort of like challenge, having meetings with with the a clinical lead, psychiatrist at the gender clinic, and eventually, because I was having so much sort of trouble still trying to get things moving, I wrote to Tony Blair, and he passed it on to the minister, the health minister. I was then stopped from seeing the lead psychiatrist there and the lead nurse, and given a nurse to see separately. It was a tremendously stressful time to go through. It was a very long process for most people, taking 7 to 10 years to get through. And I wasn't going to wait that long. I was never ever going to wait that long. So I'm basically, I'm next. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so basically my story is that you know, I mean, putting people through that just should never happen. No, I mean, there was no voluntary support. There was no peer support groups to think of in 1999 and 2000 when I went through the process. And it was a horrendous time. I actually came out of the NHS traumatised by my experience, and that's where I don't want us to go back to. But at the moment, with waiting list looking like 3 years at Leeds and growing waiting lists elsewhere, that's where I'm worried that we will go back to. It's waiting 7 to 10 years. You know, clinicians being disillusioned and all sorts of things starting to happen again. And that's what I don't want to happen. Okay, so I'll pass you over to Felix now, which is totally different.
Thanks, Helen. My story is the flip side of Helen's, really. And Helen always calls it a charmed transition, which I used to get quite upset about and say, oh, you know, I haven't had anything special happen to me, but actually I did have a charmed transition, and I know what she means now. I started transitioning in 2008, came out to my GP while I was on sick because of my dysphoria. After initial hiccup of being sent to the wrong place, I was referred to Helen, who at the time I didn't know what she did or anything about her, and I was sent to her for support with my care pathway. Helen sorted everything out for me, as she was an advocate for trans community and a social enterprise that she'd set up after she'd transitioned, got herself some more qualifications, and she wanted to give back to the community and help in any way she could, seeing how things were. Anyway, she sorted it out for me, and within 3 months that I'd actually got Helen to intervene, I had my first assessment at the local psychiatrist in Hull. And I was very lucky at the time because then the waiting times was 13 to 18 weeks. And I actually had my first referral within 3 months. And then I had the next appointment at the GIC, my first one, in the December, so that was another 3 months. And basically throughout my transition, that's how it went. I was literally on time every time. But the big thing for me was I had the support of the voluntary sector. Helen was my first contact. But I'd also been on the internet, which Helen didn't have either in them days. It was like wind me up internet. So she didn't have any of that. I had lots and lots of friends, you know, on the World Wide Web who I could turn to. Helen I could turn to. You know, I had lots of people who were supporting me. So for me, the voluntary sector is so important. Inform people who've lived the pathway, who know what they're talking about, and who can give real life experience to help other people who are going through the pathway. I think it's such an important need that we all work together, the clinicians, the voluntary sector, the grassroots groups, and we're able to get funding so that we can work together, because obviously you can't run forever on nothing. But it's such an important part of the whole process for trans people, having, you know, that inner community support, along with the clinical support, because we are like a safety net to many. And I know what some people say, oh, what about the bad experiences? Yeah, there's bad experiences, because you're going to get good with bad wherever you go. But we do, a lot of us do an awful lot of good work, as you can see from the people in this room who've come today to speak about trans community and what we do to, you know, to help really the clinicians, because they can't do everything. And we usually, you know, we pick the pieces up really at the end of the day, because some people, when they've gone through the pathway, they come out the other side. You know, this is when they've gone through all that trauma, getting there, going through it. They get to the other side and then it's like, oh, well, what do we actually do now? It's like a vacuum. And there's nowhere to go, nobody to, unless you've got that vital support. If you haven't got family support, you need the voluntary sector and you need the community people out there and the grassroots organisations to help you to survive, basically, and to move on. Some of us are lucky. Some of us can just go on, carry on our lives. We've got jobs already and we just carry on, thank you very much. But there's many, many of us who come through this process and are very, very isolated. And, you know, we've had people come to us and say, oh, thank goodness we saw you on TV, because now we know you exist. And they didn't know we existed for whatever reason, but they found out through a positive thing with the TV. And now they come to us and they're so happy to be with other trans people who they can relate to. And these are quite often 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds. It's not always the young who come to us. You know, we've got quite a spread of people who come to us, and they're just so grateful to be able to interact with others like themselves and not feel like they're on their own. So that's our message. We don't want it to go back. We want to move forward, and we want to work together with the clinicians and the other organisations.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So, any immediate reflections? I suppose I'm particularly struck by that network of support, and we're going to pick up that as a conversation in terms of what does that look and feel like along a pathway, both before, during, and in the rest of your life. So, lady at the back, Keris, can you go to the back and then come to Nick?
It's Rachel again. One of my reflections, I'm reflecting it on all the talks, discussions, but there is a link there between, and it hasn't been mentioned and brought up, and that's a link between being trans and mental health issues. And I think we need to be aware of that. At Congress last week, there was a Congress resolution on LGBT and mental health. That needs to be, I feel that's come through, but not actually being pinpointed as an area which needs to be addressed. Yeah. And also the care for people that are post-operatively as well. Because non-binary, you're still going to be trans, no matter if you've had surgery or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick?
It's actually something I'm picking up off Twitter. Which I'm looking at now, is there's quite a few people saying here that they're not being represented. You know, there are only so many of us, and under the circumstances, if you want to be heard, you've got to get out there. The community can only do so much, and it's all very well sitting on social media and complaining, but if you want to be heard, you've got to stand up for yourself and just get out there. And you've got to talk to the right people, and if you don't like it, complain. Or just do something about it and get out in and just get on to NHS England, whoever is your local authority, by the way, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, it doesn't matter. But just do something, because if you're not being heard by the right person, then it's lost.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Can we go to the lady in black at the back?
Thank you. I'm Vicky Osgood. I'm the Director of Education and Standards at the General Medical Council, and in a former life I was an obstetrician, so I have some understanding of issues around what we're talking about today. But what's come to me very strongly from what we've heard so far is the power of the patient's story. And I realise these stories are all very individual, but I think it is important that these stories are heard by people in training in particular, because it is only by hearing these stories that you understand the extent of the issues that are being discussed here. And I thought I was quite knowledgeable. I then read all the papers for this meeting, realised I was much less knowledgeable than I thought I was. I now realise I'm even less knowledgeable than I thought I was, having listened to some of the stories. So that is the sort of situation that we're in. There are various groups of people that are needing this kind of education. Those currently in practice, they need that through continuing professional development. And I think that's one very important route for people to have. There are doctors in training, both undergraduate and postgraduate, and I think the power of these stories are that we need to find a way of getting that out to those in training.
So I think we need to capture that, and we need to explore it further about how we do that in the workshop conversation. Can you just pass the microphone to the lady in orange on your left? I was coming round the table actually, so.
I just want to reply to the comment that with regards to representation, how if you want to be heard, you have to get out there, and point out that a lot of some of the people complaining about not being represented here today are sat right here today and did offer to speak. It's not the case that we're not out here, and that is a big issue.
Thank you. I think my comments are something similar to what you were saying. And Nick, I had quite a strong reaction personally to what you were saying. And I think it's really important that, yes, we're out there and we're representing ourselves as community. And my name is Michelle from Clinic Q. And at Clinic Q, we hear these stories constantly, the historic experiences and the present experiences of people. And we work holistically. We're seen as a sexual health service, the only sexual health service for trans people in the UK, but we're very much holistic services. And we're working closely with WHO, World Health Organization, to look at integrated services, because I think that's, for me, what it is. It's about the integration of services, and it's about people, including trans people, in delivering services. So not just hearing our stories, hearing people's stories, but actually, we're not just patients, we can deliver services as well for our community.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring this back to Nick, who's going to give us his story. So I know there's other hands going up. This isn't that there will be more opportunity. But just to pick up on the point about different people's stories, people's voices are in the room. And if we'd have accepted every offer of every story today, we would have been sat here sometime into the middle of next year. There is a really powerful thing about how do we find the space and time to hear people's stories in a way in which they can then lead to change and action. And that's the bit that we need to get to today. So, Nick.
You're right. Hello, good morning. My name is Dr. Nick Douglas. In my day job, I'm a health services researcher. I'm also a trans man, and my CV includes co-founding FTM Brighton and the Trans Alliance, and also very heavily involved in the Brighton and Hove City Council Trans Equality Scrutiny, one of the largest trans equality actions in the UK. I want to say today that I'm speaking here, though, in a personal capacity. And I was given just 8 minutes to talk. So I'm afraid that means I'm going to have to speak quite bluntly, and that may mean that that's a somewhat uncomfortable presentation for you to hear. Olivia, I'd like to request your indulgence if I should run over slightly. Okay, so what I wanted to tell you about what it was like waiting years for access to gender identity services. How debilitating that was for my mental health, my work, and every facet of my life, and how it contributed to the breakup of my 10-year relationship. There isn't time to talk about that, though. I wanted to tell you about what it felt like to wait years for access to gender identity services, knowing that everybody else waits 18 weeks, and watching successive NHS bureaucracies fail to address that iniquity. But there isn't time to talk about that. I wanted to talk about how it is that if I want to reschedule an appointment at a gender identity clinic, I have to write a letter, because being unstable, inherently unstable and unreliable and untrustworthy, everything about my care has to be documented in writing, even a simple change of an appointment. But there's not time to talk about that. I wanted to tell you about how after waiting years for a prescription for hormones, on the day that they were due to be given, I was blackmailed by a psychiatrist against every ethical principle of the Royal College, who told me that although they were clearly clinically indicated, I had to change my name first. At that point, I was so beaten down, I simply complied, and I changed three letters in my entire name. And this is a copy of the prescription. I keep it to remind myself that I will never allow myself to be bullied like that again. There isn't really time to talk about that, though. The other thing I wanted to tell you about was the gynaecologist who accused me of lying about being trans in order to get a hysterectomy. So directly against my express wishes, he got all of my medical reports from via my GP from the gender identity clinic that had not only sensitive references to myself, but also references to family members. I have family members that these reports pass through, but there isn't really time to talk about that today. I also wanted to tell you about how the hysterectomy went really badly wrong, and the repair surgery required me to be cut from here to here. Unfortunately, the epidural that was supposed to control that pain failed, and in the early hours of the morning, a doctor was called to attend to me. When I asked for him to stop referring to me as she, he then left the room. He was clearly offended by that and didn't return. No other doctors came that night, and the nurse on duty wasn't able to prescribe. My pain did end, you'll be pleased to hear, yet it ended when I passed out. But there isn't really time to tell you about all of that today. I also wanted to tell you about the time 2 days before my phalloplasty surgery. That's a genital surgery for trans men, if you don't know about that. I wanted to tell you how, instead of preparing physically and emotionally for this momentous event in my life that I'd spent my entire life waiting for, I spent my day on the phone for hours in fighting back tears of rage, fury, anxiety and fear, trying to beg, and I do literally mean beg, those two administrators to work together to resolve the issue. Eventually, it was resolved when I had begged sufficiently, but there isn't really time to talk about that today. And there are so many, many more things that I wanted to tell you about today, but there isn't time to talk about that. I wanted to talk about the number of times my heart has been broken by watching people in my community subjected to treatment that would shock and horrify even the most unsympathetic member of the general public if they ever heard about them. Cisgendered people have said to me that sometimes that they admire my bravery in making a gender transition, and I explained that I don't actually feel that brave. It was an imperative. I needed a life worth living, and that was the only option. But I have to tell you, and I would have to say that my transition has been the most joyous and life-affirming thing I have ever done. But I would also tell you that there were times when the NHS nearly broke me when I was at my absolute most vulnerable and most in need. So what have I learned then about being a trans man in the NHS? What lessons has this taught me? This lesson I've learned that I'm a second-class citizen, and the rules that govern fair access to NHS services don't apply to me because I'm transgender. I've also learned that as a second-class citizen, it doesn't matter if the administrative systems fail to the detriment of my care. How many times have we been promised that the administrative systems at the gender identity clinics are going to improve? They never, ever do. I've also learned that because I am trans, I can be stigmatised, I can have assumptions made about me. For example, that I'm not even competent to reschedule a clinic appointment that would never be made about cisgendered people. I've also learned that medical professionals will accuse me of dishonesty and deception, and in fact the default position is that I am a liar and cannot be trusted. And on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, they will make me jump through hoops, they will bully and coerce me against every principle of ethical medical practice, including withholding clinically indicated treatment at will, and which makes the idea of a genuine therapeutic alliance between clinician and patient a complete absurdity. These clinicians are never called to account and are indeed sometimes celebrated as so-called experts in their field. I've learned that I can't rely on my privacy to be expected or my dignity to be respected when I'm ill or when I'm in pain. And when I insist on this, I will be punished with failure to treat my pain if that is what is necessary to teach me my place. And these are just a fraction of the things I've learned about being a trans man in the NHS. And in truth, I have seen so much that I never wanted to see. I have seen pain, I have seen suffering, I've seen emotional turmoil, I've seen humiliation, I've seen discrimination, exclusion, careers stalled, lives blighted, and in some cases destroyed by lack of timely access to gender identity treatment in one of the best funded and most developed healthcare systems in the world. And the one thing that really sticks in my throat is that people like me and the other people here today, we've been telling the NHS this for years and in some cases decades and crying out for change. And the NHS has ignored and dismissed us out of hand. And although it's now extremely welcome, because the legitimate people at Healthwatch have decided to speak up, now the NHS is willing to act. After years of silence by the NHS complaints system, I might add. And so many times I've heard, well, it's just the activists making a fuss, isn't it? Most of the patients are happy. No, they're not happy. They're not happy at all. They're either so beaten down by stigma, exclusion, internalised transphobia and shame that they don't believe they deserve any better. Or they are frightened by the very real threat of withdrawal of treatment. The only difference between a patient and an activist is an activist just isn't taking it anymore. That's the only difference. But I would say also that I found hope, actually. I did find hope. I found 2 clinicians that I could work with in the gender identity system, an excellent psychiatrist and an excellent endocrinologist, and I'm very grateful to them for the help that they have given me. So what did they do differently then? They treated me as the expert about my life, and they treated me as the expert about my transition. And I'm also very grateful to the commissioner who went to bat for me at times when it was looking absolutely desperate. But all of these people did the things that they did with one hand tied behind their back by a system that fails to properly support and resource them. And the truth is that if I had not fought every single step of the way, I would not have made it. So come on, people, we can do better than this. We're talking about a group of people that would struggle to fill a football stadium at any one time. We are the NHS. We can do better than this. And I still maintain that there is hope. I really welcome the work that's being done on workforce development, and I really welcome the work that's being done on the care protocol. But we need revolution, not evolution. And I'd wanted to give a more positive presentation today, actually, on some of the preliminary thoughts on a new approach. Yes, we need urgent action right now, but we need profound long-term change. We need a 5-year forward view for UK gender identity services. And there isn't time to do that today, but I would have liked to have come along and give that talk, and I hope you'll invite me back at some point. But I will say this, if we are to make progress, we have to face some hard facts. We have to stop pretending that the GI system is well and just needs reform. It's broken. Let's be honest with ourselves, it's broken. We also have to stop ignoring and discounting the patient voice. I'm very grateful to be here today, and I'm very grateful for the last consultation event because it was probably the first one that was actually meaningful that I've been to. And it's vital to do that, but the resulting action is now massively overdue. And for me, it starts with responsibility and accountability. NHS England must lead. It must take responsibility and be accountable. I can think of nowhere else in the NHS where there's been such a historic dereliction of duty by commissioners in allowing themselves to be led by the nose by providers to such detriment for patients. The unholy pact between commissioners and providers must be broken that says we'll look the other way on the systemic failures of care if you don't draw attention to the chronic underfunding. That must stop today. I would hope for a collaborative way forward, since we must actually bring all stakeholders along in this effort for change. But we must have adequate funding, and we must have robust commissioning that puts patients first, not the gender identity clinics, because we simply cannot go on like this. And outside the clinics, for far too long, there's been an attitude, it's not my problem, while patients fall down the gaps of your neglect and your complacency. If you're employed in the NHS, or if you're taking public money in any capacity, it is your direct personal problem. because trans people have a right to equality under the law, and your professional contract will require you to uphold the law, and that is the law. What we've seen is a failure of trans people by the NHS that has been systemic and collective. But every collective is made up of individuals, and that means you, and you, and you. And if I had time, I would come down and personally look every single one of you in the eye today to make sure that the message was adequately conveyed. So, my fellow speakers have given up their time and their anonymity to speak openly and honestly, and I think quite movingly today, and I'd like to thank them. But if we failed to convince you that you personally must be an agent for change in how the NHS serves trans people, I'd like to make a request. I'd like you to go home tonight, I'd like you to have a really good dinner, I'd like you to have a really good night's rest, and then tomorrow I'd like you to start looking for another job. Because quite frankly, we do not need you, and you are simply in the way. And there is certainly no place for you in the NHS of the 21st century. But if you have been convinced that the situation for trans people must improve now, today, that you personally and collectively are responsible for bringing about that transformation, that the needs of trans people must be at the heart of that transformation. And if you are also willing to roll up your sleeves, be an ally to us, champion our interests, and fight alongside us, then I welcome you to join us. There is a very great deal to do. Thank you.
Exceedingly articulate, and follow that. Any reflections or thoughts of people who want to leave because they're not prepared to step up to the challenge? There's the door. You've silenced everybody, Nick.
Oh, I'm Leanne Wilkinson. I represent Healthwatch Devon. I don't know if I'm representing anybody here, but what I've heard today, I've not actually met anyone who's non-binary, would you believe? I felt let down. And where do I go from here? I'm living the life, like John said. Many of us want to just live the life, that we should have. It's not usual. We're not unusual. We're human beings. We're all human beings. Black, white, green, purple with pink spots, whatever. We've all had our ups and downs. But what Nick has said today is absolutely awe-inspiring. John has hit on quite a few subjects that are very, very relevant. I'm really at awe with non-binary. I've not considered that side of it. We've all been through traumas, and like Nick had said, we haven't got time to actually go through these traumas. But the clinicians are not gods. No one's God over us. And we experience this over and over again, that the professional people are trying to be gods over us. Listen to us. We're all individual. Okay? Thank you very much.
Go to Zoe.
I just wanted to mention that obviously negotiation is always the best way ahead for change. I think that goes without saying. I'd like to welcome everything that the NHS and Health Education England has done to promote and manage the process of change, of evolution rather than revolution. At the same time, though, perhaps I should mention that, as Nick says, people's feelings do run quite high on this, and there is a major legal case in preparation which will, if it doesn't work in the UK, go to Europe. At the moment, I think the focus is specifically to end psychopathologization and to require an informed consent and choice system to be put in place. Thank you.
We'll go to Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for highlighting all those issues. I think it does also bring to mind there is a need for respect both ways. You know, not everybody is bad. There are a lot of bad things going on, but there is a need for a two-way street. And I also wanted to highlight the role that a number of the support groups do and how it's far better if the professional services work with the support groups, because they're there for the times when you can't go to the professionals, when the waiting lists are long. We all want to resolve those, but we need fixes in between as well. And coming back, I really do see this need for respect both ways and really working together. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. So, I'm going to move us into some kind of workshop conversations, and we're only going to have 45 minutes. However, starting to pick up some of these, the stories that you've heard and the themes that came out of the last Gender Identity Network meeting that was held earlier this year in this room, which are the challenges really to the professionals in the room around how do you take those stories, how do you take people's experiences and the issues that people are identifying and then take those away and bring about change. So Nick's really clearly articulated that. So the workshops that we want you to try and think about are, and this is going to be in the room out on the left, this challenge around the workforce, the clinical workforce, the administrative and the managerial workforce, all those issues around training, support, clinical capacity. So John and Angela, who's just left the room, and, oh, you're there, sorry, and Jeremy are going to convene a group in that room to the left out there. That issue around the sort of the network, the pathway, what you were just talking to, Jenny, and Felix talked about, around the pathway of support, the network of support that isn't just the clinic, but the clinic are a part of that. What are the other advocacy services and support? And how do we think about that in a more planned and structured way, recognising that the voluntary sector isn't free? So Emma is going to facilitate that with Felix and Helen and Carol. And they're going to be in the room to the right out there, the Little Patrick room. The third conversation is this thing about informed consent and actually how do we move to an informed consent model. And Rosie is going to facilitate that with input from Jude and Zoe and Steve. And you're going to be in here. So I think if I suggest that you cluster around Rosie, okay? Then the fourth group is around person-centred care and support. So how do we move to a personalised model of care as opposed to a, this is your label and this is your service offer, and that's where we'll stop. So that's going to be Alice, who's there, with Susan and Will. No, Keris, sorry. Just to confuse Keris over there. So I think if you could convene over here in this corner, that'd be great. And then the last one is around building the evidence. So we know for a lot of trans services there's this whole thing around there isn't the evidence and there isn't the research. Actually, what's the truth in that? And what do we need to do to address it? So Francis is there, is going to do that session with Nick and Will. So I suggest if you go to that back corner over there. Okay, so I'm going to try and put us back together at 22, which probably means 1:45. And the facilitators have quite clear briefs in terms of what we want to get out of that. So if I can ask you to move as quickly as you can to where you've chosen to go.
And if you're at all unclear, just ask one of us and we'll point you in the right place.
Sorry, I'm just looking for the topics.
Felix, hello. Well done, thank you. Can we pass the chairs round? Are we right? Class is joining in. Can we some more chairs? Chair here. Chair here. There's a chair in that corner. Just introduce me. Just my first name. Is that all right? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry,
Get some pronouns in with that.
Sorry. Yes. You introduce yourself however you want to. That's great.
Yep. I'm Will. He. Thank you. I'm Kay. They.
I'm Steve. He.
I'm Jude. He. Terry. I get confused when I hear everybody else's. Terry. She. Susanna. She. Zoe. She. Rafiki. Mary. She.
So thank you for joining us for the informed consent part of the workshop. I'm really following on from Jude's fantastic presentation. Thanks for Jude, that was brilliant. And obviously some of the key points that Zoe made in her presentation as well. So I don't know if either of you want to start just by setting the context for this workshop. What we want to get out of the workshop, if I just started there, is think about who we are as organisations and individuals, and what we. Sorry, we didn't.
No, I just arrived late. Yeah, I'm from General Medical Council. And sorry, did you say your pronouns?
Welcome. And so this is the informed consent workshop. And what would we like to come out with is what's our responsibility, both personally and as an organisation and as a group, as a collective. And then where can we make a difference? And if there are people in this group who we think, the key people we think aren't in this group, who do we think are the key people to make a difference? And who do we want to call upon to take some action? And from that, a bit of a plan about what we're happy to do next, and what are our key actions.
take the microphone over.
Jude and Zoe, do you mind just kind of starting us off with just kind of a bit of context? What do we really want to be talking about in this workshop? What are the key points and areas?
So we're going to webcast this table, if that's okay. So there's 3 microphones.
Actually, if I may, to kind of start us off, I would like to pass.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Yes. You carry on.
Go for it.
All the other tables have bugs under the tables.
Yeah.
So we're just waiting to see. Are we okay? It's kind of like the talking stick, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
True. Oh, testing. So just to set a context, in terms of what has to be adhered to, first fundamental thing for the NHS and everyone else is the law. And the legal case in preparation at the moment is pointing to violations in Article 8, I think it is, the right to privacy. Article 14, discrimination. And it suggested also Article 3, torture, on the grounds that sending anyone to psychiatric intervention when they have no mental illness and making an adequate performance for an indeterminate period of time, making that the deciding factor as to whether they get medicines, physical therapies and surgeries that are essential for their health, is no less than mental torture. So those are the things that have to be adhered to, and at the moment there are lots of points of discrimination. And it looks like, at the moment, a fairly walkover case. One of the big questions is who has to adhere? Well, everyone. But as you know, lawyers love to take action against a specific group of people. They like to have a locus of authority. And so one of the questions is, should action be taken against the NHS as a whole, against UK government as a whole, against the Royal College of Psychiatrists as a whole, or against clinicians individually? Should the action seek to allow trans people to litigate against clinicians who have performed poorly, or should in fact the action be taken against the GMC for an obvious dereliction in duty, since they're the people who are in charge of maintaining standards and haven't? So that's the sort of the scary stuff. But if we could move from the scary stuff into another world where we don't have to worry about scary stuff, then my suggestion would be to say, in terms of thinking about risk, a person goes to see their GP and they say to their GP, I think I'm trans. Says the GP, that's very interesting. It's not an area I know a huge amount, but I know there's a lot of stuff at the RCGP online, so we can look at it together. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that means to you and what you would like from me? Yeah. And as a start of a professional conversation with primary care based on a long-term patient relationship of mutual trust and regard. Through that primary care gateway, which is the one that everyone has, that first question of what would you like from me, which is then supplemented as it is for every other somatic, indeed every other condition, these are the options that we offer. So are you saying that you'd like hormone therapy? Are you saying that you would like some physical therapies? Are you saying that you'll be wanting to head towards surgery? Have you thought of a timeline? I really need to just check out with you what your level of patient education is in these areas. Now, from that point onwards, the person just proceeds through a normal care pathway, just as if they had really anything else.
Can I say some things that I agree with you that the psychopathologization of trans identities is not helpful. And I agree that it doesn't need to be psychiatrists that do it. And in the organisation that I work in, there are people who are not psychiatrists, there are doctors who are not psychiatrists.
For future, will there be a requirement that the clinicians are psychiatrists? So it may just happen to be that the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them at the moment are psychiatrists, but that doesn't have to be the case.
So give me a second, that wasn't the controversial thing that I was going to say. So I wanted to declare that almost from the beginning. Now, I'm here with the Royal College of Psychiatrists hat on, but I'm not sure that what I'm about to say is about the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I'm not sure. I think it might actually be about the NHS as a whole. The things that you spoke about earlier on about a woman has the right to go and get HRT, that actually GPs and doctors are gatekeepers to access to treatment, whether you're having a knee replacement or whether you're requesting HRT or whether you're requesting treatment for trans issues. And at the moment, the way the NHS is set up, doctors and other clinicians, because there's lots of nurse-led services, you know, there are lots of other services that are not led by doctors. There is a person who is a barrier between you and a treatment. I'm struggling to think of one where that's not the case. And in that process, there is a person who decides, is this process or is this treatment, whatever it is, worth the NHS spending money on for this person? And as part of that, there's issues around clinical evidence, and there's issues around who's the right gatekeeper, and there are issues around what the person's medical history might be, what, in a case of a knee replacement, how long is it going to last? And that's the bit that, for me, is difficult to marry up an informed consent model and anything that's in the NHS. Part of what those gatekeepers and that guidance and NICE and all of those things are doing as well is about distributive justice. And that there's issues here about autonomy and about paternalism, but there's also issues about if we don't spend it, you know, when we spend money on one thing, we can't spend it on something else. And some of the issues at the moment around the evidence base for the current pathway, for example, there's been lots and lots and lots of kind of backlash against the evidence that we've got at the moment. So saying that it's not, you know, that it's patchy. So those are the issues that I'm really struggling to tie up as a clinician, rather than with a psychiatrist hat on, just as a doctor, about how we go from where we are to an informed consent model.
Yes, I'm not suggesting in any way that we should have some utopian model where anyone can have everything. Everyone knows that there are limits on availability, and those limits are decided by science and by money and ultimately by ethics committees where necessary. What I'm saying is that if people reasonably want a knee replacement and it's available, then
they don't always get it. They go and they are told quite often, sorry, you're not bad enough. I don't know whether
that's right, and absolutely, and that's true of absolutely everything that one gets in medicine. That's how it works. What everyone else doesn't get for a somatic condition is 2 years of psychotherapy or psychiatric assessment. What everyone else gets is, if it's something that's life-changing, is, are you capable of giving informed consent? Have you had appropriate patient education? And then finally, is this service available? And if it is available, affordable.
Before that, there is an assessment of, is this treatment appropriate, likely to improve your life?
That's right.
And that's the bit that is difficult, because an informed consent model is that there has to be a person who decides this thing is appropriate, and that's the bit that's difficult for me to get my head.
Let's go for HRT. It's not a very big problem, is it?
It's a massive problem in primary care for women trying to access HRT. Rafiq would be able to comment on that better than I would.
Well, it's a problem, but it's not an impossible problem, is it? Obviously, there are upsides and downsides to HRT for anyone, but the whole point is that you do that balancing act. That's the balancing act. That's the consent and choice and the voice model that we're talking about. We're not trying to create something different for every other UK citizen. What we're trying to achieve is equity.
What I'm saying is I don't think that exists for every other UK citizen in their health care. That's the problem.
I think...
Can I just bring in Suzanne? Do you want to come? I know you had your hand up at one point.
Yeah, my views actually is that if we take the medical model, I understand exactly what you're saying. But actually, for how long now have we been saying social model rather than medical model? So although there's been a lot of requests in the room about consent, it's actually about sometimes, in fact, it's cheaper for the NHS if the person's saying, I don't want any more treatment. I've got cancer, it's terminal, I don't want any treatment. Sometimes it's actually cheaper. Sometimes if your community is well supporting of the trans individual, you don't need to medicalize it anymore. And actually, it's kind of getting the NHS to understand that, I think.
I think the point here, though, is that informed consent and the current model we have are not incompatible with one another. The barriers that trans people face are far in excess of this. As you're saying, these barriers apply to everyone. But the problem is that the barriers that trans people face are far in excess of what everyone else faces. Again, for that knee replacement, we're not talking about 5 years on 5 years of assessments to decide if that's a good option or not. Will this improve the person's life? That's a reasonably quick turnaround for most other things. Whereas with trans people, it's a much longer and a much more drawn out endeavor. And the other thing I'd say about that is that informed consent, as Zoe was saying, informed consent isn't about, I want this, give it to me. It's more, these are the things I'm interested in, I'm not interested. Part of the problem with trans people is that we're forced into this narrative of, if we want this, then we have to have this. If we want this, then we have to have this. If we want this, then we have to have this. And it creates this chain of treatments that we don't all necessarily want. We don't all want the same thing. And being able to take that and turn it into, I would like this, that, and that, would actually save the NHS money and leave those other treatments that we didn't want available for other people. And that's what the informed consent we're pushing for
I think
is
you
about.
can have that without an informed consent model. You're preaching to the converted.
Well, I think that is informed. I think that is informed consent. I mean, informed consent is saying, I would like this, and they tell you about it, and you learn about it, and together you decide if you want a thing or not. I mean, I don't see how that's not what we're going for here, and incompatible with what you're suggesting.
So, the main issue is around what trans people need to go through in terms of the psychological,
But also on top of that, it's what treatments they're pushed into as a result of that psychopathologist.
Yeah, so it's what follows that process as well.
That it's not actually it's not possible to have a personalised care pathway because of rigid ideas about everybody who has this has to have this first, etc.
I don't think it's...
A few things from a GP's perspective, or a doctor's perspective, I think we're also talking in a vacuum, not regarding litigation. And that really does dictate a lot of how doctors have to practice. It is the reality. So when you talk about informed consent, and you've made a decision as a patient about anything, I'm still liable to be sued as a doctor if I haven't given you the information upon which to make the decision. Or if someone argued that you weren't in your right frame, if you weren't in the right frame of mind to make the decision, to actually you have the capacity to make the decision. I'm not saying that applies so much here, but and I think people need to understand that we are not in a context where informed consent can dictate the social model. I don't think can work. If someone has to sign a prescription, it is that signature that ultimately is the one that will go to court and lose their career. And that is one of the biggest fears that GPs have in the whole prescribing issue, is that drug X and I've never even heard of drug X, it becomes a bit of an issue. And then I need to get informed. And it's about who would know more, who would be able to offer me support, and the fact that these are our licensed medications has a big issue to doctors. Then there's also the issue about that information. I think you're absolutely right that you mustn't be forced down a pathway, but at the same time, I don't think we'd be sat here today if we had a situation where there was enough money for this service. I think actually we're trying to blame other parts of the system. I agree with your point about, you shouldn't be forced out of community. We've all said that. We got that. I think the issue is that you have to create a budget per person. And at the moment, the budget is not enough. And you've got 3-year waits to get into the GIC, so that's totally unacceptable. And if we had enough money, I think we would be able to personalise the care, because there wouldn't be the anxiety from the commissioner's perspective. But what are we opening? What door are we opening? Because whilst I agree you might save money in some cases, you might have the opposite of this. And it's about safeguarding resource and evidence-based practice. And unfortunately, when you have to compete against other non-gender issues for funding, then you've got to be talking the same language. And I don't think it's impossible to improve the situation, but I'm not sure. I think you have to ask the right thing, and I think it's actually about money, and it's about flexibility to offer the person what they want. I think those are the two issues.
Could I bring Terry? Did you want to say something? Because I know you've had hand up.
Yes, I thought about, in fact, two clinics talked about their work, which was done on the informed consent model. Now, the difference is, of course, that they were still not the GP, and so GPs are in a different position. But people would walk in off the street, more or less, and of course there was some assessment. They weren't just handing out stuff. But the person, by the end of the day, would probably have seen more than one person, talked to more than one person, and they would actually be given the product. So it's possible, but we can't leap from the system we've got now suddenly into something else. We're going to have to do it incrementally. And Rafiq's point, I think, in this field in particular, about the conflict between the doctor watching his or her back and the informed consent of the person, because even if you have a form, and many doctors are using an informed consent form that you fill in. Exactly. When it comes to GMC, a doctor is actually not protected by that, or not sufficiently protected by that. Now, we have to change that, I think, in order to allow informed consent. There has to be some give on the other side so that doctors are better protected if they have taken those steps. And the person has been found to be competent to make the decision at the time. They may change their mind. It happens. And we've got to be able to accommodate that and not have a person who's absolutely made up their mind, this is what they're going to do, and then they do eventually. It hardly ever happens, but when it does, someone can turn around and say, well, you shouldn't have let me do that, you shouldn't have let me have that surgery or whatever. So, that's the answer, it's a question.
Can I just bring in Jude, because we've been patient?
Okay, so I want to say a couple of things. First of all, about GPs, I would like to bring in the kind of example of my GP, who's actually pretty rare in terms of listening to a patient who kind of is informed and does their own research and learning alongside that patient. And in the case of, for instance, my antidepressants, which I have refused for about a decade because people were trying to push on me medication that I didn't want when I didn't want it. When I finally decided I've tried everything else, nothing else has worked, I want to try antidepressants, but I'm scared of side effects and things not working for me. I've done my research. this is the drug that I think might work for me. And my GP said, well, that's not one that we normally prescribe. Like early on, we usually try these ones first. Explained why I had reason to believe that those drugs wouldn't work for me. He said, it's worth a go. I'll prescribe you it for 2 months, see how you go. Come and kind of, I'll monitor you. I'll see in 2 months and we can assess how it's going. And it went brilliantly. And I'm like, the only person I know who's got the right antidepressant on the first go, and I was a suicidal mess last year, and I'm not now. Which means that it takes a leap of faith on a doctor's part, but it is entirely possible to work with your patient to get them the treatment that they want. Point A. Point B, in terms of saving the NHS money, because I'm aware that it's not limitless. You can save a lot of money by, like, the whole getting waiting list down and, simplifying the assessment process. That is not just the benefit of a trans person, that's the benefit of an NHS. If someone's time at a gender clinic is like 6 months or a year rather than 5 years, that saves the NHS a lot of money. So there's that to consider, because I went to my 3 meetings with Nottingham before thinking, okay, this isn't worth it, and that took the best part of a year, and obviously all the admin at the either end of that. If you cut all of that, I could have had 1-2 meetings much closer together, which wouldn't have cost half the money. The other thing I was going to say is that, again, to kind of bring up Kay's excellent point, if, for instance, people like me who want literally just one thing, so I want my top surgery, I don't want bottom surgery, and I don't want HRT, which are, way more kind of complicated and time-consuming, need lots more follow-up and kind of, I would have my top really not need the NHS ever again, goodbye, kind of on that front. Then that frees up lots of money for people who actually do want HRT and bottom surgery and are currently having to wait monstrous times for it.
Yeah, I do. I just kind of want to follow up on what's going on down here, but basically what Terry was saying about informed consent being a two-way street, it protecting the clinicians as much as it protects the patients, that's very important. If you have the informed consent and you consent to a procedure, you shouldn't be able to turn around later and say, well, that was wrong, because you discussed it, you researched it. You shouldn't be, I'm not saying you can't, I'm saying you should be protected from that. And I know that's a difference. And on top of that, the other issue is that the clinicians have a bad habit of assuming that patients understand less than they do. And I realize at large that might be true in a lot of cases, but a lot of patients, particularly trans patients, do go into this knowing what they want, what works, having done quite a bit of research. And there is a saying out there, I can't remember the exact saying, but it's something to the effect of the people who know any kind of illness best are the people who are living through it. And I do think that's very true. I definitely have gotten the impression through mental health, through gender services, through my physical health. In all of those cases, I've done the research and I feel like I understand the things I'm dealing with a lot better than the GPs and in some cases the specialists I'm talking to, because in most, I wouldn't be saying this if the clinicians at gender identity clinics were trans themselves, but they're not. And that's an important factor because we live through this, we do our research, we talk to other trans people and we form our opinions, and we can go in with a good idea of what we want. I can go in and say, I have a situation at the moment where I want to go into the gender clinic and say, you want to prescribe me this? I've been on this before privately and it doesn't work for me. Can we skip this? Can we go to something else like this, which is different but similar? And I can sit here and say that that's what I'm going to do, but at the same time, I know I'm going to turn around and they're going to turn around and be like, no, that's not standard practice. We don't do that.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just, sorry, I'm going to be really strict because we've got 10 minutes left and we want to make a plan. and we want to make a plan about next steps. So how do we move this conversation forward? How do we begin to think about how we can take some next steps and change the things we want to change?
Well, I would say to build on what Kay just said, that you. Okay. So basically. Okay. So basically, to work on what Kay was saying, we do need to ensure that there is we develop a way of obtaining informed consent that protects clinicians as well as trans people, but then make the clinicians make sure that they use it, and it's not just some optional thing, that is the main model that is used.
Can I just, because I'm aware Stephen's spoken, so Steve, do you want to have a next say, and then Zoe, can I bring you in?
I think what I want to say is that I still don't understand the difference, really, between informed, it's not consent, is it? Informed
consent,
and what we're planning for anyway, which is about individualised care plans and a process that treats an individual as an individual. Now, there will be, clinicians will, if I'm a surgeon, I will want to have justified to me and justify for myself that I'm doing the right thing. Not only about protecting my back, but about protecting the patient in front of me as well. So I need to have some sort of process or some sort of guidelines to help me to do that, to protect patients in front of me and to protect myself. But what I do think, and certainly as commissioners with NHS England, what we want is individualised care plans, and that is being built into everything that we're doing in NHS England at the moment. Now, yeah, but and many points have been made about this is about cost, and to an extent it's about cost, and there might be some upfront investing that needs to be put in to bring waiting times down, because a lot of the problems that we've got and that we're discussing around this table about the length of waits and etc. can bring those down and have individualised care plans. I don't think that we're far away from informed consent. I really don't.
So I'm going to bring Zoe in, but I just want to, what I'm hearing, and this might not be right, but I think the individual and personalised care is one thing, but what I'm hearing is that people are saying that rather than equality of service, it's excess. People who are wanting to transition or receive gender services the surgeon has to be
extra vigilant.
Yes,
this is what's happened all the way throughout the discussion, is the normal and usual constraints and problems that attend every clinical encounter and the daily experience of clinicians have suddenly been inflated into a major problem. There will always be a shortage of money. There will always be regret rates for all sorts of things. There will always be a mismatch between the individualised care that's available and the system that's available to deliver it. This is true for everything. Surgeons always need to check that they're actually taking off the right leg, for example. There's always that as an issue. It's not extra or different for trans people. It is made to seem so by transphobia, which locates itself right the way back to the intervention of psychiatry.
But you could argue...
Can I just say, finish off if you don't mind? One of the issues is, it will not, my advice would be that it will not suffice for psychiatrists to rebadge themselves as a gender identity specialist for people to believe that they're not being psychopathologized. That isn't how medical education works. If we could produce new A&E consultants with a 6-month program, then that would be great, wouldn't it? But that isn't how workforce works. So I think we start out by saying, number one, no psychiatric intervention at all unless requested.
If people want counselling support, go to counsellors. Number two, take the hysteria out of the system. The same circumstances apply for this somatic condition as they do for everything else. It's no worse than, I don't know, diabetes, for example, or pregnancy. Yes, it's all, indeed, cancer. Yes, they're all high-stakes decisions. Yes, people make particular choices. And yes, there's a range of processes. That, I think, is the starting point.
So, where do we move to, and how do we action some of those things? Please do.
Can I just ask, has there been NICE guidelines?
No, because NICE doesn't. We have tried to get NICE to do something interim, but one of the problems is that the medications are unapproved. They're licensed, but they are not approved for use in this area. So that's another barrier. Well, we're trying to do something. But we have to work on those things too. And the other thing that is happening that I think will be helpful is that, some of you know this, but the ICD-11, when it comes out, will have moved what was transsexualism, will be probably gender incongruence, into category Z, out of mental and behavioural disorders.
So say that again.
The ICD-11, which is due to come out in...
The ICD-11 is
International Classification of Diseases.
World Health Organization,
is dropping transsexualism from the heading mental and behavioural disorders, and will be moving it into a different category, probably Z, something like that, which is non-pathologizing, but still allows you to access treatment. Because if you're not in it, if you're not in the ICD, you don't get treated. So that's important.
Which doctors should be aware of.
Yeah, they will be. Yes. And I think it's important also to understand.
Starting point might be to say, make a statement that just simply says, at the beginning of the service specifications, trans people are treated as having an intersex condition.
No. No, absolutely not.
Not asymptomatic intersex?
Biologically, it is. It isn't.
It is not. Intersex is
It isn't completely different.
It is.
Well, no, it's historically been regarded that way. If someone has repeat polymorphisms in the gene coding for the androgen receptor, they're regarded as being trans. If they have androgen insensitivity syndrome, they're regarded as being intersex. The problem is historical. People were not able to know things about trans conditions, but they now do.
I understand that, but there's an important. It's more than just a medical difference. It's a very important social difference.
Oh,
we're not going to fight that very easily by just saying
sometimes,
they are
but
the same thing.
some of it's that intersex conditions are many different things as well. I mean,
I'm perfectly aware of
obviously,
this.
so
this is a conversation which could go on for way past the 1 minute we've got left. Can we just have
treated as a somatic condition?
Sorry,
trans people are treated as having a somatic condition.
And how does that relate to the different organisations and providers here about how they
the GMC needs to listen to complaints. It never has done in the past. That would be very new. The Royal College of Psychiatrists need to withdraw their guidelines, which, explicitly pathologise. Commissioners need to think about how they're going to commission and to work closely with workforce in order to develop a new category of people. The Royal College of Physicians needs to be brought much more on board, and physicianship and general practice should be seen as the route through to treating trans people. Psychiatry should just withdraw. Surgeons need to be brought on board too. But it's essentially a workforce, commissioning, and Royal College, psych, physicians, surgeons issue, with the GMC actively pursuing claims of transphobia. One tweet said, let's face it, if the GMC took complaints of transphobia seriously, it would end in a week.
Sorry, can I just ask which organisation you're
GMC.
Because I think what's really important when we move forward, and Zoe, I might call on you to feed back, because because I'm desperately trying to write, and I haven't managed all that you've said. But I suppose what I would want to see from the group here is some commitment about where they're going to take this next and how we get people on board, the different colleges on board and the GMC on board to take what, are people in agreement with what Zoe said about?
Which aspects? I think Zoe said a lot of things.
Okay, I've ditched intersex and said,
okay,
obviously
so we're ditching intersex, yeah. I'm in agreement.
So can I just have a couple of words from the organisations around the table about some personal commitment? They've heard what people have said around the table, and we need to make a plan to move forward. Can I start with this? Can I start with you?
Yes, I mean, I propose that we draw out all the guidance that is relevant to these issues and make sure that, I mean, you know, I'm afraid I came into the group a little bit late. I wasn't sure what
that's
the
fine.
model actually is, because I thought that's what we actually operated on.
So I suppose that the commitment is listening to what's being said and happy to then be part of the taking it back to the organisation and thinking about what's our organisation, what's our responsibility from an organisational perspective, what do we need to put into this and engage in the process moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I would say then that we can remind doctors, with respect to the doctors present, of their duties in regard to all of their patients, to treat patients as individuals, to come to decisions about treatment with their patients. You know, having that conversation with them about all the options available to you, what's the benefits of each, and making a decision based on the patient's
One of the things the GMC has just done, but not made it very public, is they're developing a statement about GPs cannot use religion or belief, whatever, to not treat trans people. I mean, that would be
do you mind if I just quickly move round?
Wasn't really a conversation that it's about a philosophy, and a philosophy that probably goes against what GPs would say, because we would see that you don't actually train to be part of a profession, knowing that you could do harm to someone. You always have to do the best you can in your knowledge for the patient. And whilst your example is a great one, Jude, where you probably gave good arguments and made sense to the doctor and said they were happy to prescribe, there will be instances where that will not be the case. And you can't. I didn't become a doctor to be told what to do by a person. I became a doctor to try and help them and do the best that I can within my knowledge. And I think that's where there's a fundamental difference in the tone of the conversation. And if you want someone to prescribe hormones and do it as a robot because you've already made your mind up, but don't come to me as a GP, I'm afraid that's a fundamental problem that we have. What I'm happy to do is tell my colleagues at the RCGP that there are barriers that don't need to be there. I'm happy for people to be vigilant to the fact that sometimes patients' perceptions of what they're being asked to do could be changed. I mean, what's being told they have to do isn't always right, and they should challenge that. And GPs are advocates for all patients, and sometimes we hear about things that aren't right across the sector, not just in the trans world, and we should be there to advocate for patients.
And I know having these discussions and making some personal commitment, but I suppose what would be, even if it doesn't sit right at the moment, is a commitment that you will continue to engage in this dialogue and engage in the dialogue with trans and non-binary people in where this does take us further down the road.
I do think that's interesting that none of the apologists have said people who have any leverage or power within their organisations and who are not generalists but actually have already got a slight degree of interest in this area. And if this is the reception you're getting from someone who is actually, I would see themselves as a trans activist, then wait till you see what happens when I send an email
Okay, folks, we need to pull this back. So if I can encourage you to come back and take a seat.
And the two organisations who have been the biggest talk to decide the general practice aren't even here. They were invited. They said they were going to send someone, and they didn't. The GPC of the BMA and the LNC were the negotiators for what GPs actually will get paid and what their contract says they have to comply. They're not the
I'd like to just say to everyone that we have just launched the e-learning for GPs. Their website is down at the moment, but when it's up again, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to start doing some feedback, whether people are sat nicely or not. I'm going to go to the most well-behaved group, possibly because they were the smallest. So, who's feeding back? Alice is going to feed back. And you were talking about personalisation.
Yeah. So I knew you were going to come to us, and I've got pages and pages of scribbled notes. We talked a lot about personalised care planning and became very aspirational, but also quite pragmatic in a number of different things. So I think in no particular order, there was a big discussion about becoming less consultant-led, less paternalistic, engaging much more of a general engagement approach, a therapeutic approach, opening out models of care to aspects that are led by peers, advocates, nurse practitioners, therapists, a whole range of different approaches. There was a discussion around better consistency around MDT and care coordinators, so multidisciplinary teams and care coordinators. We had a big discussion about whose care it is anyway. If it's a personalised care approach, then this is my care, and we should undertake a shared decision-making approach. There was a discussion about personally held care plans online. So this exists already in other health areas where I own my own care plan and I choose who to share that with, who has access to it, who I invite in to contribute to my care plan. That might be others from the voluntary sector. It might be a range of different clinicians. So there was, and these are things that exist already that we can sort of steal and learn from and adapt. There was a discussion about the GP not always being the first port of call, and I think we've heard that several times already today, both in terms of it's not always who people think about, or that there's a fear sometimes to go to your GP, and the importance of support elsewhere. So again, we kind of, although we were talking about personalised care planning here, we sort of touched on the importance of the voluntary sector and the advocacy sector, and the network support ongoing in terms of managing a personalised care plan and ongoing support. The other thing that we talked about was the development of a gender portfolio idea. So this is something that's driven by the individual, talks about their own care plan aims, that talks about what their stated aims are, which might be binary focused or might not be at all. So that's something that's driven by that individual, held by the individual. And what people were saying was this is the clinicians are alongside, not there to do 2 or to do 4. So that was really important. And again, there are examples of how that works in other areas of health, so that there's things that can be sort of stolen and developed. And then finally, really big ambition, but designing a person-centred care model, so sort of throwing some of the cards up in the air, getting a lot of people in the room and designing what shared personalised care looks like when it's not binary focused, when it's not driven in a particular through a particular route. And as Guy said, we could put that model out to tender. The providers could be multidisciplinary, multi-sector, and that would be a bear pit, but that's perhaps something to be embraced.
So did you have any actionable things that people are going to take away and do?
So lots of those things, we've got a big table, but lots of those things are actionable in terms of they exist, we should pinch them and develop them, and then there's some aspirational things over a longer period of time, so I will write those up in a table.
Cool, thank you. I think that feeds into Emma's conversation probably that Tara's going to feed back
Hey, so we kind of were talking about how local-based trans organisations could work better with gender services and the NHS in general, I guess, try and kind of link up the dots. We had a fairly energetic conversation. I think one of the big themes that kind of came out there that we kind of wanted to get across was the theme of expertise and also the theme of us and them culture, which seems to pervade. And when I say that, I mean that often local organisations aren't respected for the expertise that they may actually bring to the table. Although, interestingly, some local organisations are also used quite a lot by, I mean, for example, I'll speak for myself, from a Tyne Trans perspective, we undertake work with Newcastle Sexual Health, we undertake work with the police, we work with the Probation Service, we work for a lot of different public bodies, the list goes on, but we don't get paid. And that kind of moves to one of the points which we kind of came to next, which was historically trans organisations. There seems to be an issue there in lack of understanding around, for example, commissioning processes, a lack of understanding regards funding and access to funding streams, and perhaps as an actionable, it would be kind of cool if there was a way to facilitate those organisations being given those expertise. Okay. One of the issues that we did bring up a lot regards local services and is a concern is that of quality assurance. How do we know whether those organisations are actually going to be able to deliver what they need to deliver? And I think I understand that worry. I think, though, that that's something where you just put in the standards and then you have a means of assessing those standards. That's not an impossible mission. I certainly think that's doable. Okay. And I think the last thing was value. I think we do bring a lot of value to the table. And I think that historically one of the things that's happened, rightly or wrongly, I think that a lot of trans-based organisations do the work that they do. So, for example, we engage in community development, we engage in peer support, we engage in one-to-one casework. We provide a whole range of services. The reason we do that is because there's nothing else there for trans people to go to. So, for example, I have service users who are the victims of domestic violence. There are no domestic violence services for trans people on a local level. They can, for example, ring Broken Rainbow, which is great, but then Broken Rainbow will want to refer into a local provider. There are no local providers. And that kind of thing is repeated across the board, which then means that the actual delivery of that service, albeit the trans people themselves who are there delivering it aren't trained to deliver that service, they try to make do the best that they actually can. So again, we're kind of talking about service delivery. Where are the services? There aren't any specific services. Nobody knows what trans is. Certainly in Newcastle anyway. Okay, where else? I think there was talk, Emma, about an offer to the GMC around training, and we did talk about trans awareness work a lot, and that's really important work that needs to be undertook with a lot of different service providers. Again, I deliver training myself. I see how little people actually do know, and I think one of the problems historically has been that people have the public story of trans that they have seems to be enough for them. But then when you actually start to talk about other issues, some of the things that we've kind of talked about a little bit in here today, so if we talk about things like cisnormativity, once you get to that kind of level, people turn off because it's all about politics then, even though it's not about politics actually, it's about people's identities.
Cool. So your actionable stuff was to pursue a conversation with the GMC about training.
I think the GMC conversation, and I think the other thing was we need to find a way to deliver some kind of expertise to trans people who are involved in these local organisations to facilitate them being able to actually access funding streams. So, for example, I mean, at the moment we're busy writing quite a large bid for Reaching Communities bid. and it's about organisations understanding where they can go to do those things.
So something about infrastructure support, development and training for the local voluntary sector.
Yeah.
Okay. Angela.
We were thinking about education and training and came to the conclusion that trans folk meet a vast range of different sorts of discipline, from administrative staff through to general practitioners, through to psychologists, speech therapists, endocrinologists, surgeons, every stripe of medical practitioner. And we think there needs to be three tiers of training. One is stuff that you would expect absolutely anybody working in the NHS to know, from the ward domestic all the way up to a consultant orthopaedic surgeon and all shades in between. Then there is stuff that you would expect people to be a little more specialised and know something about. What you'd expect a district general speech and language therapist or endocrinologist to know, which is more than the orthopaedic surgeon, but probably not a tremendous amount of expertise. And then there's people who really ought to be expert, and it's going to then divide down by discipline. So what an endocrinologist working in a gender identity clinic would need to know would be not the same thing as a speech therapist would need to know. How to train people. A big driver is Health Education England. And because they commission the training for nurses, the people that most patients in the health service will spend most time meeting. And there needs to be the involvement of an awful lot of royal colleges, obstetrician, gynecologists, surgeons, psychiatrists, speech and language therapists, and also the British Psychological Society for Psychologists, to draw up those basic level, intermediate level and expert level competency. The good news is they all meet through the Association of Royal Medical Colleges, which can pull in the BPS as well. The GMC isn't a training organisation. What the GMC does is approve as reasonable things that are put forward to it. So their role is to have something put to them. Clearly there'll be a bit of a conversation beforehand about what is appropriate. And then when that's done, they sign it off. There would clearly need to be a considerable amount of patient involvement at the basic level of training. There are just not enough people around in this field. We'd never get a day's work done if we had to educate every GP in the country. That's probably going to fall to patient groups, who I think would probably do it better.
Cool, thank you. So, Jeremy, are you going to pick up?
So, just building on what James described, we had around the table the Royal College of Nursing, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, Royal College of Physicians, BPS, BAGIS, GMC, and it was really encouraging to learn what was happening in this field actually and to see how the dots could start to join up. But I think there was a view that it would have been really helpful to have Health Education England around the table to help us take the discussion forward. And then the second observation is it was clear that we're just scratching the surface because there's so much to do. The discussion that we had focused on, the competencies and skill sets that are required across the professional groups, really only touched on the issue around what we heard this morning around experience in primary care, didn't really touch at all on the skill sets of managers and administrators. And crucially, we didn't have time to talk about the immediate recruitment and retention problems in the specialty, because you heard Barbara and Will describe this morning that even though NHS England has invested an additional £5 million in the service this year to start to bring the surgical waiting list into line with the 18-week standard by the next financial year, the main constraint is not the funding. It's the lack of capacity, the trained specialists available to help us reduce that waiting list quicker. So we can't really take forward that discussion that we keep having at every workshop about waiting lists. And we're going to have that discussion in the context of entry into the GICs as well. So we do need that help from colleagues at Health Education England.
Okay. So, very briefly, but with a microphone.
It's not just the NHS on training and development, it's the independent sector as well.
Okay. We'll move on to the group talking about informed consent.
Okay, we thought we were looking for positive actions to take. We thought it might help if the national service specifications began by saying something like trans is treated as a somatic condition in which individuals may elect for binary or non-binary physiological change. We felt it was time for the Royal College of Psychiatrists to withdraw. We felt that rebadging psychiatrists as gender identity specialists was disingenuous and legally risky. Recognising the limitations on all NHS care, we felt that commissioners should support individual care pathways on the same choice and consent and availability basis as they do for all other somatic conditions. Yes, we know that not everyone gets what they want and all the rest of it, but what we have here is a kind of a hysteria about trans people that doesn't seem to exist for anyone else. We thought it would be very helpful if the GMC took the complaints of transphobia seriously. One tweet said that transphobia amongst doctors would end in a week if the GMC did. Workforce planning would need to focus on developing a physician-led and surgically-led service with physical therapies and elective counselling support, not provided by psychiatrists, provided by counsellors, which is much cheaper. Education is needed not simply for general practitioners, physicians and surgeons, but actually for the colleges themselves. So the Royal College of General Practitioners, of physicians and surgeons at the most senior levels need to understand the kind of changes that are happening. They need to understand much more about the new methods of commissioning and the new view of trans before it gets as far as their members even. I think they also need to understand the risk that they have by attaching themselves to a psychopathologized model. Managerially, the service needs to relocate from mental health services into mainstream NHS services. The NHS needs to persuade the Minister to get HRT approved for trans people. After all, this is a government with strong links to industry. It shouldn't be a problem, and prescription should be done by GPs as it is for everything else, and the same should be true of elective blockers for children. The big issue, of course, was money. We were all worried about money. I think we should all be more worried about ending an obvious inequity that's been in existence for 40 years.
Sorry, Zoe, just a couple of points of clarity. I think the majority of what you said is a fair reflection of what went on around the table, what was agreed. I think the first couple of points and first couple of statements that you made where I think you put a statement forward and said, does everybody agree with that? And we've started going around the table and we didn't get around the table. So I don't think it's fair to say that everybody around the table agreed that. And certainly in terms of we agreed that the service specification will start with, it's not within our gift to agree that around this table, and that has to go through the CRG, and that then has to be recommended to NHS England. So again, I wouldn't want it to be misrepresented what's within our gift to agree around this table. But certainly the majority of what you said was a good indication of the discussions that went around the table, and the moving away from the psychopathologization of services is actually what we all want to do.
No, thanks, Steve, for that helpful corrective. I think what we did agree was it would be nice if service specifications could, begin with that kind of statement, rather than feeling that it was in the gift of anyone in this room to do that.
Okay, can we go to Rosie and then?
Yes, and I just think it's fair to say it was a big debate with not everybody agreeing from their stance. A lot of moral positions of coming into the GPs, for instance, have a position individually to make sure they're doing no harm. There was also a point I think which is important to make that not all the right people are here in the room, and a lot of the people in the room from organisations are people who are already kind of behind the programme and want that, but it's about how we influence that wider, in organisations, those people who actually are the people putting up the barriers. So I think there was that we need to think about how we reach those people as well and get them in the room and get them signed up to the debate.
Yeah, good. And I think that probably got picked up by a couple of other comments that I've heard around. Actually, we've got a lot of trans allies in the room. How do we get to people hidden in the Royal Colleges, in the places where they hold power, who don't necessarily engage in these conversations? And I think that's something that kind of everybody in the room needs to think about. How do we get to some of those people? I'm going to come to Francis's group. Who's doing your feedback? Cool.
Hi, thank you. Will, can we do a bit of a double act? Because I know you took some really good notes, so that would be really helpful. I'd just say, just on that question, actually, of who's in the room, is it correct, actually, that the Health Education England aren't represented today? Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah, I just wondered if we could actually write to them and express, or somebody from NHS England could write to them and express our disappointment that in the vastness of that organisation they couldn't find someone to come for half a day. I think that would be quite an important statement to make. So our group were looking at the evidence base, and there's something of a kind of conundrum, really, in the sense that in some cases there is a feeling that there are massive evidence gaps. So, for example, we don't actually really know about what the optimum kind of service specification is. We're told often that the approach that we have currently is an evidence-based approach, but it actually, doesn't stand up to any real scientific scrutiny. So on the one hand, we've got lots of kind of evidence gaps, and then on the other hand, there's a sense that the evidence that we do have isn't really being properly used and taken account of. So, for example, Michelle told us about the fantastic work that Clinic Q are doing in relation to the holistic sexual health work that they do, and they have kind of lots of evidence. It's actually quite difficult to get that kind of taken account of. So I think we had a discussion about kind of what counts as evidence, and we perhaps need a broader conception of what counts as evidence. And we had a bit of a discussion about who collects that evidence and how that is regarded. What do we consider as legitimate evidence, and who do we trust to provide that evidence? And, I probably shouldn't try and recreate that full conversation here, but it's a question to raise. We also had a conversation about who has historically been missing from evidence gathering. We wanted to put trans people at the heart of evidence gathering because it has historically been seen that we are subjects, we are specimens to be researched upon, and it was quite rightly pointed out that many of us bring skills and something to the table that we could contribute. We also noted that there was something about the silence of the academic sector and what can we do to more proactively bring the academic sector into that evidence gathering process. So I think I should probably wrap up there and hand over to Will, because Will had some really great notes as well.
So just building on Nick's points, we talked quite a lot about the culture and environment in which trans and non-binary people receive services, and we thought it was really important that the NHS commitment to about both acknowledging and tackling the systemic inequalities for trans and non-binary people was very explicit, because that's a whole part of the way in which people's experiences are felt. As Nick said, we talked a lot about trans and non-binary people being empowered and resourced to give evidence, and we're really very much prioritising focus on community and voluntary organisation and individual experiences. We talked, as Nick mentioned in his talk earlier on, around the need for an NHS England research strategy around the needs of trans and non-binary people that involve the academic world, that credibility, and we talked quite a lot from a Public Health England perspective about the vital importance of published and peer-reviewed information. In terms of data, we talked about needing to know more about, or documenting better, the needs of trans and non-binary people, that we also need information about workforce. The NHS employs lots of people from different communities. How is that visible around trans and non-binary? We talked about the importance of understanding the use of services across the NHS by trans and non-binary people. And then our final point was about looking at research and outcomes of NHS services. What are the evidence of effectiveness and excellence in the services that exist at the moment, and what might that mean if we had that evidence about how we would change things into the future. So we're aligning a view of our needs with the way in which services are commissioned and delivered.
Cool. I think just to pick up on the point about Health Education England not being here, I think that we can commit to saying, yes, as NHS England, we will write to Health Education England. And so part of what happens next is that we need to firstly write up all of these conversations. We need to share it with all of you in order that you can go, actually, that's not what we said, or you've missed this, or we can clarify what some of the points are. And importantly, who's picking it up to take it forward? So everybody in this room has a contribution to make to that. How do we make sure that we harness that energy and that expertise in a way that the actions people take can actually be galvanised together as opposed to happening disparately? And I think the Writing to Health Education England is a similar point that was made on the informed consent table that I overheard, which is about getting to people in some of the colleges who do hold power. So how do we raise the profile of this to get people to pay attention, as opposed to it just being the lone voice within that college banging their drum and then being ignored by their colleagues. So there's something that we need to do with that. So I said we will write this up. We will try, and when it comes out, you need to be able to say, actually, I'm happy to be a part of taking that forward. I'm happy to commit to doing something here. And that can't just be the trans activists in the room. That has to be some of the professional activists as well. So we'll write that up. We'll get it out. We have another trans network meeting planned for November. It would be fantastic if professional colleagues wanted to join in that network meeting. It's open for anybody to attend, and it is a really good opportunity for us to reflect back from that network who identified some of these issues, what progress has been made by November. We'd like to think that we could reconvene this grouping with missing colleagues in January, February time to think about actually what's different. So we sat in a hot room today. We've heard some difficult things. We've heard incredible passion and experience about a hopeful future, because actually this is hopeful. We can do things differently. But what will be different come January, February? What progress will we have made? So we'd like to think there would be progress. If not, it would just be another Groundhog Day. But we have to stop repeating the experiences of the past. So, any final comments from the room before you melt? There is food smells wafting in from the corridor. Can I thank everybody for your involvement and participation today? Can I particularly thank our speakers for sharing incredibly deep and passionate stories that I know, Nick, you were speaking from some notes. I think we'd like to try and translate your notes into a blog that we can maybe use as part of the event reports. And similarly, if there's other blogs that people do, if we can start to capture some of those thoughts as you go away from today, that would be really helpful. So thank you for your time. Lunch is out there.
Shall I write that down in a way that you can actually read? Let's try again. I'll try again. See what I'll do. No, I've done the first. Take my hand. C-O-U-G-L-A-S. I have the most appalling handwriting. Sorry, I do.